Greetings, everyone. I'm Shadow Watch. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this video helps you drift off to sleep. Before we continue, please like the video so I can keep creating more content like this.
Story number 1. I learned a secret about the Bermuda Triangle, but I wish I hadn't. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with the ocean. My mom hated it. She used to tell me all the time, if God intended for us to know about the ocean, He wouldn't have put so many obstacles between us and the bottom of it. I thought that was a bit reductionist, but when I insisted on studying biological oceanography and ocean engineering, she was as supportive as she could possibly be. College was the best time in my life. I loved my studies. My mom and I even bonded over it as she let me tell her all about what I was learning about the ocean. Even though she didn't love the field I chose, she still pitched in for my education and encouraged me to live at home until I was done. She was my biggest supporter. 2 weeks after I graduated college, my dad died. And with his death, my mom seemed to lose all her will to live. She tried to hold on for me, but every day I could see the light slipping from her eyes a little more. She died the day after my interview for my dream job, and to this day I'm convinced she did that on purpose. She knew her time was coming, and she waited so I wouldn't miss my interview. My friends always tell me that's a little morbid, but when I light candles for my mom's spirit, I can feel her there with me, and I know it's true. Anyway, I got the call with the job offer a few days after her funeral. Another small blessing that I knew came from her, and despite wanting to just lay down and give up on everything, I accepted the job. I was still heartbroken about losing both of my parents within a few months of each other, but the job was everything I had dreamed and more. After a few years, I was given the opportunity to join a team that was researching previously unexplored parts of the ocean. I got assigned to the coolest place ever, the Bermuda Triangle. I know, we all grew up hearing stories about the Bermuda Triangle, and most of them can be explained by science and weather patterns. But the stories that can't be explained by science, unfortunately, I can offer you an explanation for. Turns out my mom was right. Sometimes obstacles are there for a reason. The first few weeks of our research expedition were exciting. We had a place we were staying in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, but since that's still a good 640 miles from our research site, we also had a fairly nice boat we were staying on, and the team got funds for a submarine. I won't bore you with all the scientific details of our expedition, but after about 2 months, we were granted permission to send 4 people into the Bermuda Triangle in a submarine. Our team lead decided she would select 3 people to go with her, and out of our 11-person team, we knew there would be a lot of disappointed people. She said she would give us her decision individually to avoid the awkwardness for everyone who wasn't selected. I was a bundle of nerves for the whole week it took her to decide, but on a bright, beautiful Sunday morning, Marnie found me in my bunk and told me I had been selected. To be honest, a part of me knew deep down that I was going to be picked. There was no way all of these things would have lined up so perfectly, just for me to be left behind while someone else went on the submarine trip. As it turns out, we would all be better off if someone else had been selected. 3 days later, we were ready to take the submarine down to the ocean floor. The people in our group were myself, Marnie, an older man named Jacob, a guy about my age named Evan, and the 90-person crew running the submarine. We all had our hopes for what we would discover, but I think everyone was just elated to be a part of something so big. The first few days in the submarine were mostly spent getting our bearings, charting, mapping, and getting used to being so deep underwater. After that, we were able to use some pretty high-tech equipment that looked a lot like the suits astronauts wear to actually leave the submarine. I still lay awake at night and think about what that was like. The ocean was dark. It reminded me of fog, actually, the way you can see up to a certain point before it all blurs into one meaningless color. Only instead of fog, we were in an inky darkness all the time. I could see a few feet in front of me at any given moment. The wonders of the ocean hidden behind a cold, wet, dark veil, all there for me and my team to uncover. After a couple days of collecting samples and specimens, Jacob and I made a huge discovery. Caught between a rock and the ocean floor was a scuba suit, in a design neither of us had ever seen before. Our suits, top-of-the-line equipment not currently available to the public, looked a lot like spacesuits. This one looked like a toddler had tried to copy what we were wearing, but lacked the ability to really do it justice. The hands looked like mittens, almost exactly the way a small child would think to draw them. The helmet was oddly oblong and looked like a large bucket with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. The eye and mouth holes were covered with glass, and the top of the helmet was rounded instead of flat like a bucket would be, giving it an odd misshapen appearance. The body was misshapen as well, with a barrel-like torso and uneven arms and legs. While I couldn't tell what the helmet was made from, it was clear that the body seemed to be made out of leather. The helmet and body almost seemed suctioned or glued together. There was no zipper, no buttons, no way I could see to dismantle it in order to put it on. More importantly, it was clear the suit was very old, but it showed none of the signs of damage that something like that should have after sitting at the bottom of the ocean for so long. Jacob and I glanced at each other, then rushed toward the strange sight as if we were both thinking the same thing. We worked together to move the rock off it, then cleared the debris that had gathered around the suit, mostly fish bones and small carcasses. We did so in complete silence, but despite the lack of words, I knew we were both beyond excited. Whatever this was, we were on the cusp of an incredible discovery. We freed the strange-looking diverse suit and carried it back to the submarine. An hour later, Jacob and I stood with the rest of the crew. Everyone hovered around the table we had placed it on. We had debated for a while if we thought it would hold up, bringing it out of the water and into a strange atmosphere, and Marnie logically decided we needed to resurface as quickly as possible so we could get the suit to a temperature and moisture-controlled storage facility. She told the submarine captain, and he said he would prepare us to resurface first thing on the following day. In the meantime, Marnie told us to work our asses off to get as much done as possible before departure. She told us that if the submarine went back down, she would probably give other people on the team the opportunity to be on the crew. That was disappointing, but I agreed it was only fair. We put the suit in the storage room we had reserved for samples, locked the door, and went back to work. That night was when the first unusual thing occurred. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to piercing shrieks and raced out of my bunk into the hallway. One of the crew members, Rodriguez I think, was kneeling on the floor, clutching his head and screaming. The captain knelt next to him, trying to talk over the sound of his screams. But all we could hear was Rodriguez repeating over and over, "The eyes, it's eyes." Nobody knew what that meant, but his fear was both palpable and contagious. The captain assured us that sometimes people struggle with being underwater for very long, and Rodriguez would get the best medical and psychiatric care possible once we got back to the surface. He insisted we all go back to bed, and everyone complied, slinking off to our bunks like a bunch of chastised children. The first thing I did in the morning was go back to the captain and ask if Rodriguez was okay. The captain smiled in greeting and assured me that Rodriguez was a bit sick, but they were sure he would be just fine. I thanked him, and as I was leaving I heard him call out, "If God wanted us to explore the ocean, we would have gills." It was my mom's favorite joke. Every time I talked about new advances in oceanic technology, she would say that to me with a smile and a pat on the arm. I turned around and stared at the captain. I said, "What was that?" He was already facing away from me and glanced back over his shoulder. "Sorry." "What?" I knew my face was tight, my voice reflecting my nerves. "What did you say?" As I was walking away, "You said something about exploring the ocean." He gave me a concerned look. "Are you okay, Dr. Williams?" I didn't say anything. I nodded, every muscle in my body feeling like a tense rubber band. Yes, I'm fine, thank you." I guess I was just lost in my thoughts. As I walked out, he muttered, "Can't have another crazy on my ship." I made my way back to the sample room, which was once again unlocked, and joined Marnie where she stood next to the area we had reserved just for the diving suit. Marnie had sent Evan out after Jacob, and I came back to chip some pieces off the rock that had pinned the diving suit to the ocean floor, and he had also collected some bits of detritus around the area as well, like fish bones and other carcasses. I walked over and said, "Have you had a chance to crack the suit open?" Marnie smirked, knowing I was messing around, and said, "Right, because I want to be the ocean version of the guy who destroyed the city of Troy." "No, but there's the craziest thing." I lifted an eyebrow and Marnie went on, "I don't think there's a body in here." I looked over at the diving suit and felt a strange pang of fear shoot through me. "How did it get down there then?" Marnie shrugged, unbothered. "Maybe it dropped off a boat or something. We might never get an answer to that, but we can do some testing on it to see when it was made and what it's made from." I scooted away from the wetsuit. the room feeling claustrophobic now. Have you had a chance to run any tests? Or are you waiting until we resurface? Marnie started to answer, when the door opened and a sheepish-looking crew member walked in. He said, "Doctors, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have some bad news. We aren't going to be able to resurface today after all. We're experiencing serious technical issues." Marnie and I both looked at each other, mirroring the panic on each other's faces. And in her best stern voice she said, "Define serious issues." The crew member glanced over his shoulder as if he was waiting for someone to step in and take over for him. Then he replied, "I'll let you have that conversation with the captain. All he told me to pass along was that we're experiencing some strange weather that's interfering with the radar, and he doesn't feel safe resurfacing until it passes. He can lower us back to the ocean floor so you can continue your research though." Marnie sighed and passed a hand over her face, looking weary. "Yes, tell him that would be good. And please update us at your earliest convenience." She stressed the word earliest with a look on her face that always made lab assistants duck their heads and promise to do whatever she asked. The crew member was no different, and he turned to flee quickly. Before he could escape, I said, "Wait, what about Rodriguez? Is he going to be okay?" The crew member went pale and said, We don't know. Captain Cameron says dash." He stopped and squared his shoulders back. "He'll be fine. We'll get back to the surface as soon as we're able. And in the meantime, he's fine in Med Bay." I let him run out then, and turned to Marnie, who had already turned her own attention back to the samples. Before I could ask her thoughts on what was happening, she started giving me instructions, and I ran over to help her with the tests. If we had to be stuck underwater, we might as well be productive. While the equipment we had on the sub was good, it wasn't the equipment we needed to safely test the material of the suit, so we focused on analyzing the other specimens we took from the site instead. As we worked, I felt like the suit was a third person in the room, watching and judging silently as we worked. Jacob and Evan joined us at some point, and the four of us made plans for how we would use our time until the sub could resurface. Marnie was mostly frustrated that we didn't have a timeline. She wanted to map out as much time as possible, but hesitated to do that if she didn't know how much time we had. Jacob and I encouraged her to schedule our days as if we were going to be staying for the full 5 days we would have had left, and promised to do all her top priority items first. With that settled, we went to the mess hall for dinner. When we got there, I noticed that there seemed to be fewer people than usual. Rodriguez was missing, obviously, but I also noticed one of the female crew members I had started bonding with was gone too. I grabbed my food and sat down across from someone I had seen talking with her before. I smiled and said, "Hi, I'm Mara Williams, one of the researchers. Do you know where Claire Mason is?" The crew member, I thought his name was Reynolds, gave me a weird look, then shook his head, stood, and left his half-eaten tray of food where it was. I watched Reynolds walk away, feeling equal parts confused and irritated. A few minutes later, Marnie walked over and grabbed my arm. In a harsh whisper, she said, "You need to come with me." I stepped out into the hallway, feeling anxiety wringing my stomach like a dish rag. Marnie didn't say anything, but we walked down the hall until we reached sick bay. Once we got there, Captain Cameron stepped out with a concerned look on his face. I had last spoken with him that morning, and in that time it was as if he had aged 20 years. He waited for us to step inside, then shut the door and said in a hushed voice, "Thank you both for coming. I'm sorry to be treating this so clandestine, but I have some concerns. I think you'll understand." He took a deep breath before continuing. "We seem to be having a problem with psychosis on board. You both saw what happened with Rodriguez. In the last 24 hours, we've had 2 more crew members experience the same thing. That may not sound like a lot, but when you're on a machine like this one, you need every person to be in the best health possible." He stepped aside and we saw Rodriguez, Claire, and another crew member I thought was named Anderson, all laying in their beds. They were asleep, they seemed peaceful. Cameron continued, "They're sedated. Every time they wake up they start screaming again, and we want to keep this quiet from as many people as possible. I told the crew we believe there's a bout of mono going around, and to be cautious and stay out of sickbay. It's not a good solution, but it's what we have right now. I need you two to see if you can figure out what's going on." Marnie lifted an eyebrow and put one hand on her hip. "We're not equipped for that, Captain. Neither of us have a degree in medicine or psychology. Don't you have a doctor on board? Captain Cameron gave her a look that I can only describe as pure desperation. Our medic isn't equipped for this either, and we don't have a psychologist for this expedition because it was supposed to be a short one. Please just do blood tests, something. Work with our medic and use any of his equipment that you need to. Figure out what's going on. Captain Cameron left and I turned to Marnie and said, "This all started the night after we found the diving suit. Do you think we brought some kind of bacteria into the ship that's making people sick?" Marnie winced. "Shit. I hope not, but maybe we did. I'll go take a sample from it to see if there's anything weird. You go finish your dinner." She started to leave, then stopped. "And Mara, do not speak a word of this to anyone. We want to keep this quiet." I sulked back to the mess hall, feeling like my trip of a lifetime was slowly blossoming into a nightmare. I finished my food, then went back to sick bay to check in with Marnie. She wasn't there, and the medic was back, but he hadn't seen her either. Concerned now, I went back to the storage room. Sitting on the floor in the corner of the room was Marnie, tears flooding her cheeks, her eyes looking hollow and glassy. I ran to her side. "Marnie? Marnie? Are you okay? What's going on?" She didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there like a shell of a person. I ran from the room to the sick bay and told the medic what was going on, then went to the control room to look for the captain. When I told him what happened to Marnie and what our suspicions were, his face grew hard. He said, "Lock the room you've got that thing in and don't let anyone touch it. If one more person gets sick, I'm making you and your team get rid of it. And I'll make you bleach the entire storage room to make sure no one else gets sick." I apologized for all the trouble, agreed to his conditions, and left to update Evan and Jacob. I know Marnie told me not to, but with her out of commission, I needed as much support from the rest of our team as possible. When I got to the men's bunk area, Evan and Jacob were both there looking tense. They motioned me inside and we huddled together on Jacob's bed. Jacob leaned in and whispered, "About 20 minutes after you and Marnie left, we heard more screaming. Rugen this time. He was in the hallway near the storage room, clutching his eyes, and..." Jacob hesitated as if he wasn't sure how to explain it. He was begging for forgiveness. I don't know what about or to whom, but he kept saying, "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry," over and over. Evan took in a shaky breath and said, "We tried to help, but the person you were sitting with before Marnie grabbed you, I think his name is Reynolds. He pushed us away and told us not to say anything." My mind reeled. It seemed like something about the suit really was making people sick. Maybe Rugen had gone into the storage room for some reason. Or maybe, an even worse thought, the bacteria on the suit that was causing this had migrated from the storage room somehow. An image popped into my head of invisible bacteria crawling along the floor, lit by a black light showing it moving in waves towards new victims. I looked up at my two teammates and said, "Cameron, Marnie, and I think the diving suit we found might have something to do with all this. Like maybe there's some kind of bacteria on it causing all this. And with Marnie in sick bay now too, I think we may be right." We all stared at each other for a long time before Jacob said, "This is bad." Evan and I nodded our agreement. Then Evan asked, "Well, now what do we do? We can't get rid of the suit. Who knows what kind of discoveries we can make with it?" And he cast his face down. "And this discovery could put all of our names on the map, you know? We could be something." Jacob put a fatherly hand on Evan's arm. "Safety is far more important, Evan. Don't sacrifice lives to have your name on a plaque in some museum." He turned back to me and said, "I think we need to put the diving suit back in the ocean, Mara. Some things weren't meant to be found." I looked back and forth between Evan and Jacob, feeling the weight of being the tiebreaker resting on me like an anchor. Finally, I made the worst mistake of my life. I said, "I think we should try to stop whatever this is before we put the diving suit back. We came all this way, and I think it's what Marnie would want." I could tell Jacob wanted to argue with me more, but when I mentioned Marnie, he closed his mouth and lowered his eyes. We agreed to meet in the storage room in an hour to try and find a way to keep the suit quarantined so no one else would get sick. The running theory was that some kind of bacteria was causing encephalitis, swelling in the brain, that was causing hallucinations and catatonia. We didn't have the right tools on board to properly diagnose them, but it was a good place to start. The three of us split up to look for supplies that might help. Evan left to look for cleaning supplies. I went to Med Bay to get masks and gloves. And Jacob simply said he had an idea and ran off on his own. We had agreed to meet up outside the men's quarters again, which were thankfully on the other side of the building from the storage room. A little after 9, I rejoined Jacob in the hallway. When he saw me, he sighed and said, "I knew it. I have a bad feeling." I lifted an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He gestured around us vaguely. "Evan isn't here. I haven't seen him since we parted ways. And finding cleaning supplies shouldn't have taken very long." I shook my head and handed him the gloves and mask. "Throw these on and let's go check." Jacob sighed again. "I had hoped to stay away from that area until we can deal with this. But all right, let's go." We walked to the storage room together, and when we got there, Jacob pulled me gently away from the door so he could enter first. When we walked in, neither of us were surprised to see Evan laying on the floor, hands over his head, sobbing. Jacob and I walked over and dragged Evan to his feet and carried him to sick bay. When we got there, we found a horrible sight. Somehow, in the last hour, 10 more crew members had gotten sick. We had started with a smaller crew, around 90 crew members, 30 people per shift, 3 shifts if I remembered correctly. Since we were a smaller sub, we didn't need as many people. We were now down 15 people, including Marnie and Evan. We were quickly turning into a skeleton crew, and while I didn't know very much about submarines, I had a feeling that was really bad. After we dropped Evan off, Jacob and I went to find Captain Cameron. We opened the sick bay door, and before I could process what I was seeing, Jacob had pushed me to the floor and slammed the door shut. Walking down the hallway was the diving suit. It slumped and lurched as though only one part of it at a time was able to hold itself up. We watched through the port window in the door as a crew member came around the corner and ran into the diving suit. The man smirked, as though he thought someone was playing a prank on him, and looked into the eyes of the mask. His face fell, his eyes widened, and he began sobbing. I tried. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to let her drown. I was only a kid." He continued to sob, curling up into a ball on the floor as the diving suit continued to move. Jacob pulled me away from the window and placed his back to the door, blocking the port. We stared at each other in silence for a long time before he said, "Okay, this is bad and hard to believe." I nodded, feeling panic wrapping its cold, clammy hands around my throat. "What's happening? Is someone in the suit?" Jacob took slow, steady breaths, and I did my best to copy him. After a few minutes, he said, "I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think we can explain this." He turned and looked out the window again and took a deep breath. "We need to get back to the men's bunk." I grabbed our wet suits, and I think we'll need them. I was able to manage a small smile. Jacob was a good person to have on my team. We made our way out of the med bay, both of us shielding our eyes with our hands to avoid looking directly at the eyes of the suit. As much as I wanted to believe there was some logical answer, it seemed like people were having breakdowns only after looking in its eyes. We moved slowly, taking small, careful steps as we walked down the hallway. We could hear more screams echoing around the ship. They seemed to be coming from the other side of the ship, which was good, but it wouldn't be hard for the creature to catch up with us. We finally got to the bunk room and Jacob threw the door open, both of us barreling inside quickly, and we collapsed to the floor in a relieved heap. Jacob was breathing heavily, his face red, and I was worried he might have a heart attack. I found a bottle of water and passed it to him, then waited for him to recover. Finally, his breathing steadied, and he nodded to me gratefully, then pointed across the room to where 3 diving suits sat on his bunk. I rushed forward and carried his over first, then grabbed my own and put it on. Once we were both fully suited up, I turned to Jacob and asked, "What now?" He gave me a stern look and said, "We have to get that thing off the ship. It's too risky to try and contain it." I felt the words like a deep blow and hung my head with shame. "You're right. I'm sorry." Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and gave me a tight smile. "We'll make this right. Don't worry about it too much." We both put our helmets on and stepped into the hallway. Jacob carried the body of the 3rd diving suit, I carried the helmet, and we made our way towards the control room, hoping Captain Cameron would be in there. The plan was to find Captain Cameron and get the word out around the ship that the thing could only hurt you if you looked into its eyes. We still weren't entirely sure what happened if you looked at it, but what we had seen so far was disturbing enough that neither of us wanted to try. I followed Jacob through the ship as he led us away from the screams, taking a more circuitous route to the control room as we avoided the shambling creature. When we arrived at the control room, Captain Cameron beckoned us in with a relieved look on his face. There were 11 crew members crammed into the small control room, and once we joined them, we were officially at capacity. We handed Captain Cameron the diving suit and explained the plan. He nodded, looking grim, and said, "That's better than risking anyone else's safety. How about I lead the creature towards the exit hatch as a distraction? You two just get over there safely and wait. Novak will watch the cameras in there and release the hatch once you three and the creature are safely inside." He gave us a pitying look. "I wish I didn't have to put you two in so much danger, but I don't see another option." Jacob and I both nodded resolutely, and I said, "It was my decision to bring this thing on board. I want to do what I can to make it right." Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I was involved with that decision too, and I second this one. Let's fix our mistake." Captain Cameron nodded, slipped into his diving suit, and the three of us stepped into the hallway. Jacob pointed to the right and then at Captain Cameron and nodded, then pointed to the left and gestured for me to follow him. We made our way down the hall towards the exit hatch. It was a sealed, pressure-controlled room that we could use to come and go for specimen collections. It was also exactly big enough to hold me, Jacob, and the creature. The few crew members we passed, we warned about what was happening and told them to hide somewhere safe and keep their heads down. I was starting to get nervous about the number of people we had sedated in Med Bay now. I don't know exactly how many people it takes to run a submarine, but with people dropping like flies, we had to be down to the wire. It wasn't long before we could hear scraping and shuffling coming down the hallway towards us. Captain Cameron rounded the corner, walking backwards with his head down. I glanced at Jacob and realized that if the thing pursued Cameron instead of us, we would never be able to get rid of it. I stepped away from the doorway and put myself between the creature and Captain Cameron. It didn't break stride, but when Cameron shuffled off to the side, it didn't change course to pursue him. I took over, walking backwards, until I made my way into the isolation room. It shambled after me, but didn't stop when I put my back against the wall. Kept moving towards me until it had me pinned against the exit hatch. I kept my eyes down but called out, in a shrill voice laced with panic, "Jacob, he's got me pinned." Just as I finished speaking, I felt a hard slam and glanced up just enough to see the creature reeling back before slamming its head into my helmet again. I watched in terror as a small spider web appeared in the glass. The creature put its hands on either side of the helmet to hold me in place just as Jacob was able to open the hatch behind us. Water rushed in and the creature was sucked out into the inky blackness. I had been able to get a good look at its hands before it was sucked out, and my stomach sank with dread. I was almost certain the suit was stitched from human skin. Even with that fresh panic, I was thrilled gravity and physics took care of the problem for us. Then a leathery hand reached back inside, wrapped itself around my ankle, and yanked me into the cold, dark ocean. Despite our depth, I could tell a storm was raging above us. The water would briefly light up with a lightning flash, revealing the tide battering everything in its path on the surface. I could only see the creature when the lightning would flash, but I could tell it was trying to get back to the submarine with me in tow. I fought and kicked, trying to get away, but the grip it had on me was inhuman, making all my struggles to get away seem meaningless. I was about ready to give up hope when I saw something come down on the creature's hand. Jacob had found a large rock and brought it down on the wrist part of the suit. It weakened the thing's grip just enough for me to get away, and I crawled backwards. In the momentary flashes of light, I could see Jacob fighting to get away, and I began searching for a rock too. I could see the spider web in my helmet growing, and I knew it wouldn't be very long before the pressure would break through and drown me. I found a medium-sized rock and fought against the water pressure to lift it. At some point, Jacob got free from the creature and helped me lift the rock, and together we carried it to where the creature was pinned by the rocks Jacob had been able to grab, struggling to free itself. We dropped the rock on its sternum as the lightning flashed, illuminating the thing's eyes, just as I looked at them. Instantly, I was transported somewhere else. It was a sunny day in November, unusually warm and bright, and I walked down a hospital hallway. I was moving slowly, even though the nurses had called to tell me to hurry. I had been scared. I knew my mom was close and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. I think part of me had hoped that if I never got to the room, I would never have to see her die. In a sense, I was right. I didn't have to watch her die, because she had already passed when I got to the room. The nurse said if I had only been 1 minute earlier, I might have been able to say goodbye. In the memory, I sank to my knees in the doorway of my mom's room and began weeping. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned around, expecting to see a doctor, but instead I found myself looking right into the face of the diving suit. When we made eye contact, I was plunged again into a memory. This time I found myself kneeling at my dad's graveside as my mom sobbed beside me. It was the moment I had known I would lose my mom as well, one of the most painful days of my life. Again I felt a hand on my shoulder, but this time I looked down, saw the human leather glove, and closed my eyes tight. I felt the creature turn me around, could feel its face inches from mine, but I refused to open my eyes. I could feel its rage radiating out from it as the hands moved from my shoulders to my sternum and began tearing my chest cavity open. The fingers sank into the soft skin and tissue between my breasts, biting through the meat of my flesh and wrapping around my bones. I could feel my rib cage bending and instinctively opened my eyes as I screamed. I was instantly plunged into another memory, this one from the time I had dealt with a stalker in college. But this time I was ready, and as soon as I felt the creature's hand on my shoulder, I bolted. I ran through the hallways of my old college until it faced into the green and gray of the cemetery my parents were buried in. I forced myself not to falter as I ran past my crying mother, the creature still shambling after me. The cemetery faded until it was replaced by the hospital, and I continued to run despite the burn in my chest and arms. I reminded myself it was a dream, a hallucination, but the terror remained. After what felt like years, the hallway faded into black, and I woke up. When I woke, I was in a regular hospital bed. Marnie was in the bed next to me, the curtain between us pulled back. Her face looked drawn and tired, older than I remembered. I took a moment to get my bearings, then pressed the call button for a nurse. A nurse wearing light purple scrubs walked in and lifted her eyebrows in surprise when she saw me. She said, "Oh my God, you're awake. This is incredible. Let me call your doctor." She rushed over and did something on the computer next to me, took my vitals, then ran from the room. She entered a few minutes later with a doctor in tow. They fussed over me for a while and gave me a little information, but I got the real story from Captain Cameron when he arrived. Captain Cameron, or Nate as he told me to call him, told me what had happened. He said that Jacob and I had just managed to pin the creature when I had fallen to my knees and begun sobbing. Jacob carried me back to the submarine and put me in the isolation chamber. When they opened it, I was there and catatonic, but Jacob wasn't. They weren't sure exactly what happened to him. They think he got grabbed by the creature, or maybe it was starting to get free and he ran back to stop it. Either way, Jacob had sacrificed his life to save mine. They hadn't been able to recover him. As soon as the creature was securely trapped, the storm had calmed and what was left of the crew had taken the submarine back to the surface. It was a hard journey. Apparently the storm had been a rough one, and on a skeleton crew it was extra hard. Apparently by the time we had gotten the creature off the ship, a total of 41 crewmates had been affected by it. Those of us who had been affected by the creature were taken to the hospital, and according to Nate, only a few of us woke up. I was among the first group to wake up, and even now, almost 6 years later, 8 of those people are still catatonic. I take responsibility for every single one of them. Marnie woke up eventually, and even though she said she didn't blame me for what happened, I was still removed from her team. That's okay. I'm not as interested in the ocean as I used to be. Turns out, the ocean hides some secrets for a reason. Down there too long. I keep telling them they just need them to come upstairs, to leave that cramped, dark room of packed dirt and come into the light. We all need to leave this place while we still can. I'm still clinging to the hope that it's not already too late. Did you know that in Connecticut, sellers aren't required to disclose that a death occurred in a home unless you submit an inquiry in writing? I sure as hell wasn't aware. Not until after we'd already moved in, until it was already too late. I wonder if whoever buys this place after we're gone will think to ask. I did later learn that the realtor regretted selling to us. That if he had known our situation, he never would have shown us the place. I can't help but imagine what our lives would have been like if we'd never bought the small fixer-upper off of Lakeshore Drive. That's all moot now, of course. If it weren't for the price, we'd never have looked at it in the first place, especially since it had been a foreclosure. I hated the feeling of building our lives on the shattered remains of someone else's, but Gideon and I needed to move. We had to. We couldn't stay in our old house, its recently vacated bedroom dangerously close to becoming a shrine. We couldn't keep going to the same grocery store in our tiny town, where everyone knew and regarded us with looks of pity. Once we moved to Bridgeport, we were just 2 more people amongst 100,000. We could mourn in peace and anonymity, lost in the throngs. But living in the city doesn't come cheap. So, that's why Gideon and I were looking at a fixer-upper that had sat vacant before the bank eventually reclaimed it. I should have trusted my gut when I thought something about the place was off. The new cheery welcome mat seemed at odds with the rest of the house, which gave off an aura of a deep, almost crushing sadness. It hit me like a wave when we first walked in, a split second before the scent of rot and decay followed in its wake. The realtor apologized and said that they'd found fridges full of rotten food from when the prior owners left the place abandoned. He assured us that he'd dealt with something similar before, and with a few windows left open it'd air out in no time. The house was outdated in parts, yet remodeled beautifully in others. It seemed the prior owners had apparently begun the process of painstakingly restoring it before they abandoned the place, leaving behind a new kitchen, but upstairs bedrooms that were missing flooring and plastered with faded, mildewy wallpaper. As we approached the door to the basement, the smell intensified to eye-watering levels. There was something else that gave me pause, too. Something about the basement. The space was cramped, all unfinished dirt floor, and exposed brick beyond the small area that had been set up for a washer and dryer. Right at the edge of where the faint light from the single pull-string lamp faded, was a small wooden ladder leading down into a darkness that soon swallowed it up. Despite the realtor's best attempts at leading us away from it, I found myself subconsciously drawn to it, unaware I'd even approached until I was standing at the edge. What's down there? I felt that wave of sorrow and longing the closer I got to the packed dirt floor leading down to the blackness. Nobody. For a brief moment, his salesman's smile slipped off of his face, and after an awkward silence he quickly added, just a crawl space. The smile was back. Just a little extra storage space. As my husband and I stared at the dark expanse beyond the ladder, we discussed plans to install some lighting to make that space, that took up the majority of the basement, usable. We planned a lot of things back then. We wanted to place Bree's belongings in one of the bedrooms like we had at our old home, even though part of us knew that their presence only served to highlight her absence. But the rooms upstairs were a mess, riddled with holes through the subfloors, mold behind the walls. So we reluctantly agreed we needed to complete the renovations before the space would be usable. It didn't feel right to put Bree's things in a storage unit during that time, though. Yes, I knew they were exactly that. Just things, just objects, but no matter how many times I told myself that, it felt like we'd be leaving her in a storage locker. So we wrapped up the rocking chair I'd read to her in cellophane, lovingly packed the stuffed animals and Barbies, and with the rest of the house being in the state that it was, we tucked them neatly into the only place safe from construction, the crawl space. Close by and protected while we made a safe, more permanent place for them. At first, I expected us to spend all of our free time down there, like we used to in her room at our old house. But something about that place alarmed me as much as it called to me. I think that even before we'd finished placing her belongings down there, we realized that we'd made a mistake. Some part of me knew. Maybe it was the look of that place. The black dirt that seemed to swallow up any light we directed at it from headlamps and flashlight beams, or the overpowering smell of lingering rot mixed with old earth. Maybe it was that feeling, the one of emptiness I'd felt when we first moved in, had been replaced by something far worse. As we placed the final box, the stale air down there was thick with a sinister sort of excitement. Even then, I had a vague feeling of no longer being alone. It didn't take long for the noises to start. I was running a load of laundry when I heard it over the rumble of the machine. A prolonged shriek, the sound of something sharp being slowly dragged across cellophane. It was my first time alone in the basement, and to hear that emerging from the claustrophobic space, at first I thought it was Gideon down there, opening the rocking chair, and I smiled sadly at the thought of him leaving work early, succumbing to the need to feel close to her again. I too had felt the burning desire to go down there, despite myself. Couldn't resist? I called down to the space. The sound abruptly stopped, and I heard shuffling along the hard dirt. I put a foot on the old wooden ladder, figured I'd join him so he wouldn't be alone. Felt right going down into the darkness. No one should have to be alone, especially in a place like that. That's when I heard footsteps from upstairs, followed by Gideon's voice, announcing his arrival home from work. I sprinted up the basement steps, out of breath and nearly tripping, as the only thing running through my mind was that if Gideon was upstairs, asterisk, who the hell was in the crawl space? Asterisk. As I was about to describe what I'd heard to Gideon, I suddenly felt silly. I was in a new place, with our past wounds still so fresh. Of course I was imagining things. The next morning, I was working from home when I heard it echo through the previously silent house. A giggle. A familiar-sounding one, coming from outside the kitchen window. I didn't remember leaving the window open, but when I went in to check, it was closed. Still, the laughter continued. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, floating up through the grate under the stove. It went on like that every so often. The sound of her soft laughter would float up from the basement. But there was a wrongness to it. It was laughter in name only, hollow and joyless, lacking the light my daughter had always carried. Gideon never mentioned hearing it, so I never brought it up. At the time I thought maybe I was just losing it due to stress, the stress of losing Bree, of starting over in a new city. Looking back now, and recalling the circles under my husband's eyes, the grimness there, he must have been in the same boat. The first time she spoke to me, I'd been bringing down a box of Christmas decorations. "Mom," I nearly choked on the air I'd been breathing. I never thought I'd hear Bree's voice again. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamt it. "Are you coming?" The voice, song-like, floated up from the dark. From the crawl space, a dry little cough echoed out. I lost my shit. I ran upstairs and I finally told Gideon. My husband gave me a look when I did, a look that said he understood. And if what I needed from him in that moment was to go into the basement and duck into that dark little crawl space so he could tell me everything was okay, then he was going to do it. The little room was pitch black as I followed him into it. All of our attempts to install lighting down there, temporary and otherwise, had failed. And the dim glow from the single bulb in the basement was swallowed up before even descending the ladder. We clicked on our flashlights. I wondered if he too had heard the sound of something moving across the packed dirt that echoed out seconds before we directed our beam towards the darkness. The sound of scurrying? Gideon gasped, and a moment later turned to reveal what he'd seen. A blanket has been placed across the hard dirt, one of Bree's, adorned with smiling characters from her favorite animated movie. Stuffed toys were strewn along it. A single book lay open off to the side. I didn't even need to see the impression left on the blanket to know that someone had been sleeping down there. Gideon shot me a questioning look. I didn't open the boxes, I whispered. He stared into the empty space for a long time before he nodded absent-mindedly. Insisted we leave the house, call the police to seek out whoever had been living in our home. It was a long night. We gave statements to one officer as the other searched the home. I don't know what was worse. When the first officer said there was no evidence anyone else had entered the house, or when the second officer stayed back to speak to me in hushed tones. "You've lost someone," I nodded in surprise, even though it was a statement and not a question. He leaned in. "Whatever you think you hear down there, it isn't real. Nothing good could come from a place like that. You've been in the crawl space?" I got called to do the wellness check on the Mikowskis, and he stared off into space for a long moment before he quickly shook his head, as if trying to escape from his own thoughts. "Well, I found them. They were down there. The Mikowskis." It took me a moment to place the name as that of the prior owners. I'd seen the name on some mail we still received for them and brought back to the post office. "What were they doing down there?" I asked, even though the look on his face had me questioning if I truly wanted to know the answer. "They weren't in a position to tell me." He stared past me, towards the house. "There wasn't enough left of them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I dreamt of the prior owners who never left this place. I dreamt of Bree. I dreamt of the crawl space. I awoke to the feeling of eyes on me. Gideon was sitting up in bed, giving me a concern-laden stare. "We need to talk about last night. I don't think you should go into the basement by yourself." My response was silence, confusion. "You don't remember what you said to me?" He whispered, as if he thought someone else could be listening. I shook my head. "That you wanted to go down there to be with her. That..." He choked back a sob. "You didn't want her to be alone in the dark." My horrified expression seemed to mirror his own. "You know she's not down there, Nettie. She never was." I knew that, rationally I did. "Then what is down there?" I've never seen my husband look more afraid than when he softly said, "I don't know." The longer I stayed away from the basement, the louder her laughter got, the more persistent the pleading whispers. When the hushed pleas turned to crying God, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go see her. "Are you coming?" The weak voice interjected between racked sobs. I found myself drawn to the sound, parental instincts still there, a mental phantom limb. I knew I made the right decision as I descended. Well, until I looked at her. Eyes glinted up at me from the well of blackness beyond, and the sobbing ceased instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. "No, baby." My mouth was dry as the rational part of me desperately screamed at the rest of me, reminding me I was not talking to my daughter. "I can't." I fumbled for my phone for the light, half expecting to see her staring up at me, big brown eyes wide, half afraid of what I'd see. As light flooded the room, I heard a soft movement, something wet sliding across the packed dirt of the ceiling. But I saw nothing. The little storage room was empty. As soon as the light went off, though, those eyes were back, regarding me from higher up along the wall, moving steadily downwards, never once blinking or darting away from my own. "Please," her voice repeated. My stomach dropped as I felt a chill at my proximity to the thing mimicking my daughter's voice, something I'd apparently just caught in the act of crawling down the wall. "I don't like the dark," she croaked out. "That's what broke me. That's what led to my husband finding me broken down, bawling at the kitchen table." I begged him not to go back down, but he insisted. This was our home, he'd said. If we couldn't feel safe here, then where could we? So we went down into the basement, me with my phone light and him with the emergency flashlight. It was bold of me to assume that the situation couldn't possibly get worse. By the time I'd descended the little ladder, he'd already walked into the room. He had his back to me, standing in the shadows. "Gideon, where's your flashlight?" I turned it off. "She doesn't look like I remember," he whispered. "Annette," he added slowly, never turning to look at me, his broad frame blocking whatever he was seeing from my flashlight beam. "Can you please go upstairs? Pack a bag for us? But now, please," he begged, his voice calm in tone, but shaky in delivery. He told me to leave without him if he didn't come back up within 10 minutes. To leave the house if he didn't come out of that basement, and to never come back, call movers to get our things. I nodded, numb. So I waited. I waited 10 minutes, 20, 30. After an hour had passed, I went down to the basement, and the ladder was gone. He must have pulled it down to keep me from coming after him. I felt a wave of unease, but infinitely worse, a sick pang of jealousy. Jealousy that he was down there and I wasn't. I whispered Gideon's name into the dark. "Why haven't you left yet?" His voice was weak, heavy with desperation. "Babe, it's time to go," I replied as firmly as I could. "We need to leave. All of us." Gideon's voice was choked, muffled. "No, Nettie, it's too late for me. A day has passed since then. I'm still here. I can't force myself to leave. How do I get them to come out? I just want us to be a family again." This morning when I went down to check on them, the only response that emerged from the crawl space sounded like a low, wet gurgle. They've been silent ever since. I called the police, but they didn't seem to think that my husband and daughter refusing to leave the basement constituted an emergency. I know Gideon told me to leave, but I can't just leave my family, him and Bree, down there in the dark. I'm out of ideas. We need to be together, the three of us. Please help me. If I can't figure something out soon, if I still can't get them to come to me, well, there's only one option left. The scars have faded with the passage of years and clever plastic surgery. They've been smoothed, softened, hidden as best as medical science could manage. With proper makeup and the right lighting, you'd barely know they were there. A dab of foundation, a dusting of powder, and I look almost normal. But in the unforgiving, full, direct light of my bedroom, I can see them clearly. They stretch across my face and down my body, bumpy and crimson, like a grotesque roadmap of pain and survival. I run my fingers over the raised skin, tracing the memories that refuse to leave me. They're strange and jagged, reminders of something not quite real but all too vivid. They don't just look weird, they feel weird, a constant ghostly itch under the surface of my skin. I suppose I should consider myself lucky. I am the one who survived that horrific school fire. The miracle child, they called me, the sole student who made it out alive. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe the creature remembered that it was I, after all, who saved it from the nasty, muddy wetness that was dragging it down. Maybe it remembered how I'd kept it safe from a possible horrible death, stomped under the feet of some careless kid, and somehow engineered my escape. I don't know. Truthfully, I was unconscious from the smoke long before the fire was out. The doctors said that was part of why my lung damage is permanent, why I was like an 80-year-old smoker whenever I exert myself even a little. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the story from the beginning, and you can decide what you believe. Maybe you'll think I'm crazy. Maybe you'll pity me. Maybe you'll think it was all a coincidence, a bizarre and tragic act of fate. I used to think about it all the time, replaying every moment over and over, searching for answers. It began on a gleaming wet fall morning, over 20 years ago, as I walked miserably to school. The world was washed clean from the heavy overnight rain, everything shining and sparkling with that deceptive beauty that sometimes follows a storm. The air was cold and crisp, biting at my skin, but the sun was warm when it peeked out from behind the clouds, casting golden light on the drenched landscape. I hated school. No, I loathed it. I don't have any reasonable explanation for why. I wasn't bullied. I had friends, people who would wait for me by the lockers or sit with me at lunch. My grades were fine, not stellar, not terrible, just average. But there was something about the building itself, the smell of stale cafeteria food mixed with cleaning chemicals, the droning hum of the fluorescent lights, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, suffocating, like a weight pressing down on me every time I walked through the doors. I couldn't explain the loathing that twisted in my gut each morning, so I never tried. Everyone else seemed cheerful enough that morning. The rain had turned the playground into a wonderland of puddles, and kids ran wild, shrieking and laughing as they jumped into the water, sending arcs of sparkling droplets into the air. I kept my head down, careful to avoid the puddles. My shoes were old and full of holes, and I didn't want to spend the whole day with wet socks. And that's when I saw it, half hidden in a pile of soggy, autumn-colored leaves. It was small, maybe the size of a pigeon, with scales that shimmered in the dappled sunlight like polished gemstones. Only its head poked out from the soggy mess, and its eyes, bright and blazing orange-red, locked onto mine. A damp puff of smoke hung around its delicate, dragon-like snout. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. It wasn't just the shock of seeing a tiny, impossible creature. It was the way it looked at me, as if it could see right through me, as if it knew all my secrets and fears. Instinctively, I knelt and scooped it up in my arms. Its body was warm, vibrating slightly with each shallow breath. Its wings flapped irritably, but it didn't struggle much. It seemed exhausted, waterlogged, and miserable. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and then I heard it speak. Not with a voice, but directly in my mind, clear as a bell. "I did not give you permission to pick me up." The words were sharp, crackling with irritation. I blinked, stunned, my grip tightening slightly. A group of younger kids rushed past, laughing and stomping noisily through the puddles, and the creature's eyes narrowed. It couldn't fly, not with its wings soaked and useless, and its fire seemed to have sputtered out as well. It was helpless. "Would you like me to put you back down on the pavement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mind was racing, struggling to comprehend what I was holding. A dragon? A myth come to life? It didn't make any sense. The creature glared at me, its orange eyes glowing like embers. "No," it said, the word echoing in my mind like a dull bell. It seemed to sigh, a shudder running through its small, scaled body. I could feel its exhaustion, its discomfort. I bit my lip. "Why don't you come home with me?" I suggested. "You can dry off, rest a bit. Once you're better, you can fly away. I'm not going to try and imprison you or anything." It eyed me suspiciously, and for a moment I thought it might refuse. Then it seemed to consider the offer. "And what do you want in return?" it asked, the question laced with suspicion. The words slipped out before I could stop them, like a long-buried wish surfacing unbidden. "Burn the school down," I said softly. "Please." It nodded solemnly, a regal gesture that felt almost absurd coming from something so small. I didn't think it would take me seriously. I didn't think it would remember. I didn't think any of this was real. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I tried to hide my nervousness. I ran home, my mind buzzing, and carefully laid the creature on my bed. It curled up in the tangled sheets, its scales still glistening wet, and closed its eyes. I left it there, whispering a quiet promise to keep it safe. It was so strange, so surreal, that I almost convinced myself it had been a daydream. But the next morning, the creature was still there. It looked miserable and sluggish, barely moving when I crept into my room. I thought it would be days before it recovered, and I left for school feeling guilty but relieved. Maybe it would just forget. How could I have known what was coming? The first sign was the fire alarm, a shrill, piercing wail that shattered the monotony of second period. We all looked up in confusion. Then came the acrid smell of smoke, followed by the sight of thick, roiling flames licking at the edges of the windows. The fire spread faster than I ever imagined fire could move, leaping from wall to wall, consuming everything in its path. The heat slammed into me, a wall of suffocating, blistering air that made my eyes water. I heard the crackle of burning wood, the sickening groan of the building starting to give way, and then the screams, panicked, desperate screams that made my blood run cold. The smoke was everywhere, thick and choking, and I could barely see. I stumbled, coughing, my lungs burning, and tried to find an exit. I didn't make it far. The world spun, the noise and heat crashing over me in waves, and I felt myself falling. The last thing I remembered was the feeling of something warm and familiar curling around me, shielding me from the worst of the flames. A soft voice whispering, "I didn't forget." When I woke up in the hospital, I was a different person. My face and body were a patchwork of burns, the pain so excruciating that I couldn't breathe. I had permanent lung damage, my voice hoarse and weak, my breath shallow and painful. They told me I was the only one who had survived, the miracle child pulled from the ashes. No one ever figured out how the fire started, though theories abounded. An electrical malfunction, a gas leak, a freak accident. But I knew the truth, even if no one would ever believe me. I still think about that creature, the way it had looked at me, the way it had kept its promise. I still wonder if it watches me sometimes, hidden in the shadows, waiting. The scars on my skin are a reminder of what happened, but the scars inside, those run even deeper. Some nights I dream of fire. I wake up coughing, my lungs aching, and I swear I can see a pair of orange-red eyes watching me from the darkness, a soft wisp of smoke curling around my ceiling. And I wonder if I will ever truly be free from the wish I made that day, or if some debts are never truly paid. I met Jeremy at the tail end of sophomore year, though he wouldn't have known it. Psychology major, sharp jaw, always carrying a battered, highlighted textbook under his arm. To him, I was just background, another half-smiling face in the mass of campus strangers. But I watched him. I was drawn to his confidence, the way he leaned forward when he talked, like he wanted to dissect people's words, peer inside their minds. And that casual smile, it was natural on him. He probably had no idea how that smile felt to people like me, people who lived on the edges, unseen. A glint of warmth on a cold day. For me, that smile was a flickering flame. The little occult shop in town was the type that pulled at you with its own quiet gravity. Its shelves sagged with oddities. Dried herbs, jars of something that looked like crystallized spiders, tarot cards with edges worn soft by years of handling. I'd been browsing in there since freshman year. Mostly I looked, rarely bought. The owner, an older woman with eyes that lingered too long, didn't care. That day, though, I found the book. A cracked, dust-coated, leather-bound thing stuffed under a stack of crumbling grimoires. Charms and potions to influence the heart. I nearly laughed at it, but I flipped through the pages, my fingers staining just from touching it. There, between brittle sheets and smeared ink, was the love potion spell. Irresistible allure, it claimed, with warnings written faintly in cursive in the margins. I shrugged them off. Desperation drives people to warnings, but what did they mean to someone who didn't plan on taking them seriously? Besides, I wasn't desperate. I was curious. The instructions were straightforward, even for a first-timer. A few herbs, some strange Latin incantation. Nothing I hadn't tried in simpler forms. But one detail felt unnecessary. The book advised a personal cleansing ritual before crafting the potion, to prevent the caster's own desires from tainting the charm. I scoffed at the idea. My desires weren't dangerous, maybe a little silly, maybe stupid, but not dangerous. So I skipped it, brushing it aside as some medieval quirk. Back in my apartment, the kitchen reeked of thyme, rosemary, and something called witch's lavender, a cloying scent somewhere between licorice and death. I ground the herbs in my mortar and pestle, feeling each hard crush of the stone, then mixed the powder with honey and a drop of my own blood. A required personal touch. The whole concoction gleamed dark red in the dim light, the color of a bruise. Thick, syrupy, almost alive in the jar. I held it to my nose, inhaling that odd mix of bitterness and sweetness, and felt a small thrill tighten in my chest. The next day, there was a campus event in the courtyard. Some tedious student fare with free coffee on a long table lined with dusty thermoses. Jeremy was there, chatting with friends near the theater club's booth, coffee cup cradled in his hands. Perfect. I slipped the vial out of my coat pocket, popping the cork as inconspicuously as I could. The potion trickled out in a thin stream, nearly black, sinking into the coffee like oil in water. I stirred it quickly with the plastic stir stick, looking around, heartbeat quickening, but no one was paying attention. Why would they? Then I watched him drink. Watched him talk with that effortless laugh and casual shrug. Watched the coffee cup go up to his mouth, the potion slipping past his lips. I had to pull my eyes away so no one noticed. And then I waited. It wasn't immediate, no magic spark, no grand revelation. But over the next few days, things shifted. I'd pass him in the library, and he'd do a double take, that small flash of recognition in his eyes, like he was recalling a dream. And then he'd smile, half confused, but a little longer than usual. Once, as he left the library, he turned back, lingering by the door as if he had something to say, his eyes finding mine through the glass. At first, the thrill of it made me dizzy. It was like touching fire without getting burned, like I'd somehow altered the air around me just by saying I would, by wanting it. The first time Jeremy showed up outside my class, I thought it was coincidence. Just him leaving the lecture hall next door. He walked up to me, an easy smile spreading across his face like I was someone he'd known all along. "Hey, Emma, right?" The sound of my name from his mouth was like an electric jolt. He said it like he'd practiced it, testing out the shape of each syllable. I managed a nod, feeling my cheeks heat up. "I thought I recognized you from the library." He laughed, an awkward chuckle, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "You have this focused look, you know? Makes me wonder what you're always reading about." His gaze lingered a second too long. Yeah, I stammered. "I read a lot. For class and other things." There was a spark in his eyes as he asked what I was studying, what I liked to do, if I'd want to grab coffee sometime. He seemed genuinely interested, too interested, maybe. and I found myself overwhelmed, almost uncertain. But I agreed, because, after all, wasn't this what I'd wanted? Over the next few days, I started seeing him everywhere. He'd pop up when I was leaving the library or walking to class, or at the cafe where I went to unwind. He acted surprised each time, always chuckling like, "What are the odds?" It was thrilling that first week, like I'd somehow summoned him from a distance. But soon, his presence became a constant shadow I couldn't shake. One evening, I was sitting on my dorm's front steps, headphones in, hoping for a quiet moment to myself. Then a shadow loomed over me. I glanced up, startled, and there he was, standing inches away, grinning down at me. "You're hard to find, you know that," he said, his eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "I tried to catch you in the library today." I pulled out an earbud, forcing a laugh. Didn't realize I had a schedule to keep. He didn't laugh. He just kept watching, his gaze heavy. "Just saying it'd be nice if you made a little more time for me." A few days later, Lily started noticing too. She was my roommate, my one friend on campus who knew my quirks and obsessions, though she only teased me for them. But the morning she saw Jeremy waiting outside our building, she raised an eyebrow. "That guy again?" she asked, peeking through the blinds as he lingered by the entrance. "Is he always around? Or is it just me?" I tried to play it off. "We're just getting to know each other." She gave me a hard look. "Emma, getting to know each other is one thing. Having a guy stalk you is another." "He's not stalking me, Lily. He's into me, I guess." She shook her head, closing the blinds with a sigh. "Just be careful, okay? He seems a little intense. I brushed it off, but the word clung to me. That night, I felt my skin prickle as I realized how often his face flashed in my thoughts, how his gaze felt more like a lock than a look. The next evening, as I walked back from class, I felt a presence behind me. Quick, light footsteps, then a familiar voice. "Emma." I turned. Jeremy was standing just a step away, close enough that I felt his breath sharp and shallow. "Hi," I managed, forcing a smile. "Didn't realize you'd be here." He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, holding just long enough that I felt pinned in place. "You didn't text me back." I stammered, trying to explain about assignments, a long day, but he didn't let go. His grip tightened, his fingers pressing into my skin. "I just don't get it," he said, voice barely above a whisper, his face inches from mine. "I thought we were special." "Jeremy, you're hurting me," I said, tugging my arm free. For a second, a strange light flashed in his eyes, a brief, angry spark. But then he released me, his hand falling limp by his side. He muttered an apology, his eyes trailing me even as I hurried away. When I got home, Lily was already there, tapping away on her laptop. She looked up when I came in, her expression softening as she saw my flushed face and the red marks on my arm. "What happened?" "Nothing," I lied. "Just Jeremy." "Emma, this is getting weird. You need to tell him to back off." She bit her lip, worry creasing her forehead. "Or I will." I waved her off, embarrassed, but a part of me was relieved she noticed. Maybe I wasn't overreacting. Maybe he was going too far. But I'd tell him myself, I thought. I didn't want to make it worse. The next morning, I woke to a quiet apartment. Lily's bed was empty, her things untouched. I assumed she'd left early, maybe went to the library or for a run, though she was usually one to leave a note. I texted her once, twice. No response. By evening, worry settled heavy in my chest. I tried her phone again, hearing only the hollow rings on the other end. I called a few friends, checked the library, even the student center. No one had seen her all day. Then, around midnight, I heard a knock. Faint, almost hesitant. I opened the door, half hoping to see her there with some explanation. But it was Jeremy. His face was shadowed, his eyes rimmed with something dark, like he hadn't slept. "Hey, Emma. Been waiting to talk to you." His voice was calm, too calm, but something in his expression, too soft, too careful, made my stomach twist. I tried to shut the door, but he pushed against it, forcing his way in. "Where's Lily?" I blurted out, fear breaking through my voice. "Gone," he said simply, like it was an obvious fact, a truth as solid as the walls around us. She was in the way. A wave of nausea hit me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Jeremy stepped closer, his face uncomfortably close, his breath hot against my cheek. "I don't want anyone else," he whispered. "Just you, Emma. Only you." I didn't know where else to go. After that night with Jeremy, his face too close, his words slipping over me like a dark fog, the only thought I had was get help. Professor Grayson had always been friendly, almost fatherly, with his students. He taught my introductory psych course last year, and I remembered the way he'd lean against the podium, speaking about human behavior with a steady, thoughtful tone that made complex topics seem less intimidating. I'd hoped he'd still have that tone when I told him about Jeremy. The next morning, I found him in his office, hunched over a stack of papers, reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up, surprised, when I knocked, but his expression softened as I stepped in. "Emma? Something on your mind?" His voice was gentle, a rare calm in the spinning chaos of my life right now. I sank into the chair across from him, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I didn't know where to start, so I just started. I told him about Jeremy, how I'd felt a thrill when he'd first noticed me, how that thrill had quickly twisted into something else, something suffocating and terrifying. I told him about Lily, about how she'd disappeared, about Jeremy's last words to me. As I spoke, I could see Professor Grayson's expression harden, lines forming at the corners of his mouth. When I finished, he sat quietly, processing, before finally speaking. "Emma, this sounds like a situation you can't ignore." He took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I know this is difficult, but I think you need to take this seriously. Have you gone to the police?" The word police hit me like a splash of cold water. I hadn't thought of it. Some part of me still wanted to handle it alone, to keep this hidden, as if speaking it aloud would make it real. "I don't know, Professor. He's just so good at talking his way out of things," I stammered. But as I heard myself, I realized how flimsy it sounded. How could I expect anyone to help me if I didn't even try? Grayson nodded slowly, leaning forward. "Emma, listen. There's a possibility here that his feelings for you have become obsessive, and that's something that needs professional attention. If he's as clever as you say, he may try to manipulate the situation. But you have to report it. Otherwise, you're the one without protection." I felt a prickle of fear and a desperate sort of relief. "Okay," I whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "I'll go." The police station was a maze of buzzing phones, murmured voices, and the soft shuffle of papers. I felt small in that space, as though every set of eyes knew my secrets, saw the tangle of regret and guilt I carried in my chest. After a short wait, an officer named Michaels led me into a room with pale walls and flickering lights. He was younger than I expected, with sandy blonde hair and a thin smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Graves, you reported a concern about someone named Jeremy?" His voice was calm, patient, as he opened his notepad, ready to jot down what he probably thought was another college drama. "Yes," I said, steadying my voice. "Jeremy, he's been following me, showing up everywhere. He's been intense. And my roommate, she disappeared. The last time I saw her, she'd confronted him. He said she was in the way." Michael's pen scratched across the page, his face unreadable. "Did you see him do anything directly to her?" I hesitated, the words tangled in my throat. "No, but I think he must have done something. She wouldn't just leave, not without telling me." He nodded slowly, watching me. "Do you have any evidence, Miss Graves? Texts? Threats? Anything specific he's done that could back this up?" "No," I whispered, hating the smallness of my voice. "But he's always there, everywhere I go, like he's watching me. And he told me I was the only one for him, that he didn't want anyone else around me, Michaels jotted down a few more notes, nodding in that patient, skeptical way that made my skin crawl. I could almost feel his judgment, the doubt coiling in the room between us. He promised to look into it, but the tight set of his mouth told me all I needed to know. To him, I was just a girl spinning a story, maybe jealous, maybe paranoid. My words felt flimsy, insubstantial as they floated away from me, and I knew they weren't enough to convince him. The call came a couple hours later. Officer Michaels. His tone was flatter than before, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Graves," he began, "I wanted to follow up on your report. My partner and I spoke with Mr. Fields, and he had a lot to say about you." My grip on the phone tightened. "A lot to say about me?" Michaels continued. "Mr. Fields indicated some concerns about your recent behavior. He said he felt you'd been following him, contacting him excessively, and..." Michaels cleared his throat. "Making unfounded accusations." I stood there, the silence pressing down around me like a shroud. That's not true," I managed, but my voice sounded thin, barely there. "Miss Graves, Mr. Fields was remarkably cooperative," Michaels replied, the clipped edge to his voice as sharp as a knife. "He's expressed that he's worried for your well-being." My head spun. Worried for my well-being. I knew I shouldn't be surprised. Jeremy had the kind of charm that disarmed you before you even realized it was happening. But the words hit like stones. "So you don't believe me?" The question slipped out, edged with a desperation I hated hearing in my own voice. Michaels hesitated, then let out a slow sigh. "We take all reports seriously, but Mr. Fields provided a different perspective. He even mentioned that he feels you may have projected certain feelings onto him, that maybe you felt hurt when he didn't reciprocate. His story was consistent." The words hit me with a nauseating clarity. Jeremy had spun it perfectly, turned me into the unhinged one. "I know what I saw, Officer Michaels," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He's been following me, showing up everywhere I go. And my roommate, Lily, Mr. Fields told us about your roommate," Michaels cut in. "He said she left abruptly after a disagreement between the two of you, and there's no evidence to suggest anything otherwise." I felt my grip slipping, a cold panic crawling up my spine. "But she wouldn't just leave. Not like that. She didn't tell me anything, and I haven't heard from her. Please, you have to understand." "Miss Graves, we understand that you're upset," Michaels said, his voice softening slightly, like he was speaking to a child. "But we can't pursue further action unless there's concrete evidence or a clear threat. Mr. Fields expressed genuine concern for you. He's offered to back away if that's what you need." I could almost hear the finality in his words, the practiced tone of dismissal. To them, this was resolved. My mind was made up, my side of the story a flimsy attempt to cover up jealousy or disappointment. I was losing ground, fast. "Thank you for your time, Officer Michaels," I said, forcing the words out, feeling them slip away like lifelines into an abyss. "Take care of yourself, Miss Graves," he replied. And then there was a click. The line went dead. The next morning, I went back to Professor Grayson's office. Not sure what I'd even say, but knowing I had to tell someone. He listened as I explained what had happened with the police, his expression darkening with each word. When I finished, he shook his head, a pained look crossing his face. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I can't imagine how frustrating this must be." His voice was steady, calming, but his face betrayed his frustration. "It's disturbing. The way he's manipulated this situation. What do I do now?" The question fell out of me, half plea, half despair. Grayson leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "You need to protect yourself, Emma. Be careful around him. Avoid any direct confrontation if possible. If there's any further escalation, the police will have to listen. They can't ignore you forever." The room felt suddenly colder, the quiet stretching thin between us. His words should have been reassuring, but they only deepened the gnawing fear inside me. Jeremy had already drawn a line around me, shutting out anyone who might have helped. And now, with the police doubting my every word, I felt as if that line was tightening, closing in. Emma, you did the right thing by going to them. Even if they don't see it now, you've planted the seed. If something else happens, they'll be watching him. I nodded, swallowing hard, but the cold dread gnawed at me. A thick stone lodged in my stomach. Jeremy wasn't just dangerous, he was cunning. And he knew how to twist things, bend reality until the truth no longer resembled itself. Grayson leaned forward, lowering his voice, his gaze locking on mine. Emma, stay vigilant, and don't let your guard down around him, not even for a moment. Do you understand? I nodded again, but my hands were still trembling. I could barely process his words, the gravity of it all settling like lead in my bones. This was beyond anything I could explain away. I had created something that now existed outside of me, something I couldn't control. When I left Grayson's office, my heart was heavy with a dread I couldn't shake. Each step I took felt weighed down, as though Jeremy's shadow had somehow rooted itself to me, stretching out of sight but never far behind. I sat in my dorm room, staring at the empty space where Lily's things used to be, feeling a hollow ache expand inside me. Jeremy had turned everything upside down with barely a handful of words. To the police, I was now the one in need of help. Jeremy was free, probably laughing to himself at how effortlessly he'd twisted the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside my window sent jolts of fear through me, visions of Jeremy lurking just beyond the glass. That calm, calculating look in his eyes. The walls seemed to close in around me, the silence thick and suffocating. I tried calling Lily's phone again, the line ringing and ringing until her voicemail kicked in, her cheerful voice echoing through the empty space. "Hey, it's Lily. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you soon." I didn't leave a message. I knew I wouldn't get a call back. After my last meeting with Professor Grayson, I did my best to avoid Jeremy, ducking down side hallways, taking the long way home from class. But it was no use. He was always there, waiting with that quiet, intense stare that seemed to peel back layers I'd thought were hidden. One night, as I was leaving the library, he stepped out from the shadows, his gaze heavy, lips parted like he'd been waiting hours just to say something. "Emma," he said, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "You don't have to keep running from me. You know I'd never hurt you." The words echoed my own thoughts. Thoughts I'd whispered to myself late at night, trying to convince myself that he wasn't dangerous, that I hadn't brought this on. "Please, just leave me alone," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But the fear in it was too real, and he must have heard it because he smiled, a slow, almost pitying smile. "Emma," he whispered, taking a step closer, "you know you can't hide from what you feel. I know you better than anyone else. Better than you know yourself." The way he said it chilled me, as if he'd peeled that thought from somewhere deep inside my mind. How could he know those words, those exact words? I had never said them out loud. The thought scratched at my brain, a creeping paranoia sinking its claws into me. Over the next few days, I saw him everywhere. If I walked out of my dorm, he'd be standing across the quad, his eyes following me even from a distance. If I ducked into the cafeteria, he'd sit a few tables away, watching with an expression that was both knowing and hungry, like he was waiting for me to break down, to finally acknowledge him. I stopped eating in public, avoiding the places where he might show up. My nerves were fraying. I couldn't focus, couldn't sleep. His words, his gaze, each encounter chipped away at the edges of my thoughts until they didn't feel like my own anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was inside my head, that somehow he knew my thoughts before I even did. One afternoon, as I crossed the courtyard, he appeared beside me out of nowhere, slipping into step as if he'd always been there. "You shouldn't ignore what's right in front of you, Emma," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "You know, pretending I don't exist won't make this go away." I flinched, tightening my grip on my bag, quickening my steps. But he matched me easily, a shadow tethered to my own. The campus felt empty, the late hour lending an eerie silence to everything around us. "Jeremy, I don't know what you think this is, but whatever it is, it's over," I said, trying to inject steel into my voice. "Is it?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious, as though I'd suggested something amusing, maybe even absurd. You think walking a little faster will change anything? You think you can just wish me away, like some bad dream? I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. This isn't real. Whatever you think is between us, it's just a mistake. A misunderstanding. He laughed softly, a sound too close to my ear. A misunderstanding? His voice was calm, almost indulgent. Emma, you made this. You made me. And now you want to pretend it didn't happen. I made him. I forced myself to look at him, summoning every ounce of courage left in me. You don't know me, Jeremy. You've never known me. His expression shifted, a hint of something darker in his eyes as he leaned closer, his voice low. I know you better than anyone. I know the parts of you no one else even sees. He cocked his head, his gaze fixed on mine. Tell me, when's the last time anyone else paid attention to what you really wanted? My stomach twisted. You're twisting this, I said, my voice wavering, but I held his gaze, refusing to back down. Whatever you think you know, it's a lie. It's in your head. You can run, he said, a strange satisfaction in his voice, his eyes glinting. But you'll always end up here. You know that, don't you? Back where it all began. With me, I felt my heart pounding, my legs aching to bolt, but his gaze held me in place. No, I whispered, voice trembling. I'm not coming back to you. I never chose this. He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. But you did, Emma, he murmured, his voice soft, dangerous. The minute you thought of me, the minute you wanted me, I swallowed hard, hating how my voice shook. Wanting isn't the same as this. This is twisted, it's wrong. It's a violation. Jeremy's smile widened, a dark, almost pitying look in his eyes. You can tell yourself that all you want. But you and I both know you've never wanted anything. Anyone. As much as this. His gaze pierced through me, his voice taking on a hint of mockery. You can't run from what's already inside you. I could feel the ground slipping out from under me, my mind scrambling for an escape. But as he watched, that strange, knowing smile still on his face, I knew he'd already won this battle. That night, as I lay awake in my bed, I felt his words echoing through my head, dark tendrils wrapping tighter around my thoughts. I tried to shake them, to convince myself it was paranoia, but his voice was there, whispering my own fears back to me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The only place I knew to turn was that old shop, the strange, dusty room where I'd first found the spellbook. Desperation had pushed me to the edge. I needed answers. The shop looked the same as ever. The shopkeeper was there, standing by the counter with that same unreadable expression, as though she'd expected me all along. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me, a slight curve of amusement at the corners of her mouth. Back so soon? She asked. I forced myself to speak, swallowing back the unease that tightened my throat. The spell I cast, the one for attraction. My voice sounded small, hesitant. Something went wrong. He's acting like he knows things I haven't told him, like he's reading my mind. The shopkeeper tilted her head, studying me. Did you follow the instructions exactly? I hesitated, shame pooling in my gut. Mostly, I muttered. But I didn't think the precaution mattered that much. The shopkeeper's eyes darkened, and she let out a long, low sigh. You thought the cleansing was unnecessary, she said, her voice more a statement than a question. Her gaze felt like it was burrowing into me, unearthing my mistake from where I'd buried it under excuses. It was just a small detail, I whispered, the words pathetic even to my own ears. Her mouth twitched with a bitter amusement. The cleansing was to protect you from yourself, to bind the spell to your intention alone. By skipping it, you left the connection open-ended, unguarded. A spell like that doesn't stop at attraction, dear. It digs deeper, attaching itself to every thought, every suppressed feeling. It binds your psyche to theirs, an open channel. My stomach dropped, nausea twisting through me. An open channel. Jeremy wasn't just watching me. He was reflecting back my own fears, insecurities, every dark thought I'd ever buried. I'd done this. I'd ripped open a door and given him free access to the deepest corners of my mind. I took a shaky breath, my voice barely a whisper. Is there a way to undo it? The shopkeeper's gaze softened, but there was no pity in her eyes. Once a bond is formed, it's not easily broken. Bonds built on the mind and heart are strong, sometimes irreversible. She leaned in closer, her voice low and steady. But be warned, severing such a bond is no small thing. Can leave both parties damaged. The weight of her words pressed down on me, the hopelessness settling in like a lead weight. There was no simple undoing, no easy fix. I had created something dark, something hungry, and now it was consuming me piece by piece. As I left the shop, her words echoed in my head, each one sinking deeper, heavier, irreversible. I'd taken a harmless crush and twisted it into something monstrous. And now I'd given Jeremy a foothold in my mind, and every step I took seemed to lead me further into his grasp. The next day, Jeremy was waiting outside my building, leaning against the stone wall with a calm, patient smile. His eyes met mine, and there was a strange light in them, something sharp, unhinged. He took a slow step toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. "You went to the shop," he murmured, his voice low, almost gentle. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't spoken it aloud. There was no way he could have known. "What are you?" He stepped closer, his voice soft and familiar, as though he was coaxing a confession out of me. "I know everything, Emma. I know what you think about at night, alone in your room. I know the secrets you keep from everyone else. I know because you let me in." Each word sent a chill through me, a horrifying confirmation that he was bound to me in ways I hadn't even realized. I felt stripped bare, exposed, every dark thought held up to the light. I tried to back away, but he caught my wrist, his grip gentle but unyielding, his eyes locking onto mine. "You and I," he whispered, his voice soft but laced with something cold, "we're the same. And no one can come between us, Emma. Not the police, not Grayson. Not even you." My throat tightened, and I felt the edge of panic rise within me, a flood of helplessness I couldn't shake. "Jeremy, this isn't what I wanted." He tilted his head, a glint of amusement in his eyes, as though my fear only fueled his certainty. "Isn't it? You wanted me, didn't you? You wanted someone to see you, to be part of you. And here I am." I felt sick, a wave of nausea washing over me as I realized the truth. This was what I'd done, what I'd made of him, of us. He was my reflection, twisted and broken, but undeniably mine. As I pulled my hand free, his smile widened, a slow, chilling curve of satisfaction. "Don't fight it, Emma," he said, his voice like a shadow crawling over me. "You're already too far in." I turned and fled, his laughter trailing behind me, echoing down the empty corridors. Each step pounded with the realization that this wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. I had bound us together, and the more I tried to resist, the tighter his grip seemed to grow, a thread weaving itself through the fabric of my mind. And I knew, as his voice followed me into the silence, that there was no escape, not from him and not from myself. I hadn't seen Professor Grayson since the night I'd gone to the occult shop, but his words had lingered, sharp reminders to stay vigilant, to protect myself. Jeremy's presence was pressing in, a shadow I couldn't shake. I knew Grayson was the only one who might understand, the only person I could trust with the truth. When I reached his office that evening, the lights were off, the door ajar. A chill ran down my spine. "Professor," I called softly, stepping inside. His desk was cluttered, books half open, a mug overturned. It looked wrong, like he'd left in a rush. I moved further into the office, the silence growing thicker. My gaze landed on a dark stain near the side of his desk, smeared across the floor. My stomach twisted as I took in the scene. His glasses broken, beside what could only be. A shadow loomed in the doorway, and I whipped around, heart hammering. Jeremy stood there, his gaze locked onto mine, a quiet intensity in his eyes. I stumbled back, bile rising as I realized he was blocking my only way out. Looking for Grayson? His voice was soft, almost tender. I told you, Emma, no one else matters. No one but us. Fear pulsed through me. I shoved past him, darting into the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Behind me, I heard his calm, measured footsteps. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew he'd catch me. Bursting out of the building, I ran toward the forest, the darkness closing in around me as I pushed through the thick underbrush. Jeremy's footsteps grew louder, relentless. I could barely breathe, but I pressed on, desperation forcing me deeper into the trees. The only thought anchoring me was escape, the fleeting hope that somehow I'd lose him in the shadows. But his voice drifted through the trees, closer than it should have been. Emma, he called softly, as if coaxing me back. You can't run from this. You know that. But I kept running, his voice a dark promise, echoing in the cold night air. I stopped in a small clearing, the cold pressing in from all sides. Setting down the supplies, I knelt and arranged the candles in a circle, my hands shaking as I lit each one. The spellbook lay open before me, the words heavy on the page, almost pulsing with dark intent. This was the severance ritual, the one the shopkeeper had warned me about. With Grayson gone, this was all I had left, my last desperate attempt to break the bond I'd unwittingly unleashed. I had no choice. Jeremy had taken everything. My safety, my thoughts, even my sense of self. Tonight, it would end or it would consume me whole. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began the incantation. The ancient words felt foreign and thick on my tongue, a strain as I forced them out. The candles flickered, and a cold wind swept through the clearing, wrapping around me like an unwelcome shadow. I could feel the bond resisting, trembling, refusing to break. A prickle ran up my spine, the eerie feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes, and Jeremy stood there at the edge of the clearing, his face cast in the eerie light of the flames. He looked at me with an unsettling mix of sorrow and anger, eyes glinting with something wild. Why are you doing this, Emma? His voice was soft, almost tender. My heart raced, but I stood up, clutching the book to my chest. This has to end, Jeremy. You have to let me go. He stepped forward, his gaze intense, unwavering. We're meant to be together, Emma. I know every part of you, remember? There's no escaping this. No, Jeremy, I said, forcing strength into my voice. This isn't love. This is wrong. Twisted. I never wanted this. His expression hardened, a flash of hurt giving way to fury. You made me like this, he said, his voice breaking. You bound me to you, and now you're trying to cut me away like I'm nothing. He took another step, then lunged, grabbing my wrist. Stop, I cried, yanking my arm back, but his grip only tightened. He pulled me closer, his face inches from mine, eyes wide and unhinged. I won't let you take this from me, you ungrateful bitch, he snarled, his voice raw with desperation. You're mine, Emma. We're bound together. You think you can just toss me aside? His fingers bruised into my skin, and I fought back, wrenching my arm free, shoving him hard. He stumbled back, but his eyes were on fire with rage, his breathing ragged. In the chaos, I raised my voice, speaking the final words of the incantation with every ounce of strength I had left, pushing at the bond, ripping it apart. A fierce wind tore through the clearing, scattering the candles as Jeremy clutched his head, a scream ripping from his throat. I felt the connection unraveling, the poisoned thread between us snapping one painful fiber at a time. Emma, his voice broke, his face twisted in pain, lost. And then, like a light extinguished, his eyes dulled, his grip slackened, and he slumped forward, his expression hollow, empty. I staggered back, watching him, the weight of what I'd done sinking in with chilling finality. Jeremy was gone, his mind shattered, a hollow shell left in his place. "Jeremy," I whispered, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no spark, just silence. I backed away, nausea twisting in my gut as I stumbled from the clearing, fleeing into the darkness. The bond was broken, but it had left a scar, an indelible mark of the cost I could never undo. The days blurred together after that night in the forest. Word spread quickly. Jeremy had been found wandering aimlessly near campus, vacant-eyed and unresponsive, as though he were caught somewhere between dreams and reality. The authorities, confused but sympathetic, labeled him catatonic and transferred him to a psychiatric facility out of town. I never visited. I couldn't bring myself to see him again. Not like that. Friends of his, those who only knew him as the smart, driven student he'd once been, tried to reach out, but he barely responded. Occasionally, he would murmur something low and indistinct, a name he'd repeat under his breath. My name. The nurses told me this one day, almost as if they thought I'd be comforted. But it only deepened the hollow ache within me. He was there because of me, because I dragged him into something I couldn't control, something I never should have touched. One night, I took everything, the spellbook, herbs, candles, and vials, to the edge of town. Beneath a twisted tree, I dug a shallow pit, threw in the items, and struck a match. The fire crackled and grew, devouring each piece, and I felt a strange calm, as though I could burn away the past. But as the flames died, a chill crept over me. In a shard of glass, I glimpsed my reflection, his shadow faintly behind me, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. Yet, the weight lingered, an indelible mark, as if he would always be there, woven into my reflection, beyond my reach.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Shadow Watch. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this video helps you drift off to sleep. Before we continue, please like the video so I can keep creating more content like this.
You must remain in the room whilst I dine, he told me 3 years ago. But face the wall, and do not turn around until I've eaten every last crumb. I nodded. I will tell you when I've finished, he brashly interrupted, having anticipated my question. And when I made the mistake of breaking his one rule, I saw something terrifying. I hate to disappoint you, but I won't endanger myself by naming this world-famous figure. I've been lying low since February, praying to never cross his path again. I moved from Los Angeles to Toronto, put more than 2,000 miles of deserts, mountains, and woodland between that man and me. Yet, I still feel watching eyes upon me, every single day. I fear that he hopes to silence me before I spill his secret. That's why I won't tell you to run from LA. Nowhere is safe from him. Instead, I'm hoping that putting this story out there will give him no reason to silence me. You're all about to learn the truth, so he'll have to tread carefully in the future, right? I know I've not named him, but I've put a spotlight on the horrors of the hills. This is a Hollywood icon, and I cooked his lunches and dinners every day from November of 2021 to February of 2024. But one particular lunchtime, an act of recklessness brought my employment to end. A flatbread topped with charred spring onions, chili flakes, and feta. That was the dish. A modest lunch for a self-proclaimed modest man. Perfectly ordinary food. I didn't serve the heart of a stillborn babe. Not the ribs of some famous rival. Just a light, nutritious dish to bridge breakfast and dinner. That day was the same as any other, so I don't know why I did it. I'd spent 3 years cooking for my client, and I'd never previously questioned his only rule. I hadn't dreamt of disobeying him, as he paid such a disgustingly inflated salary. Not until one ordinary day in late February. I placed the flatbread on the table, walked over to the kitchen counter, then focused my gaze on the wall ahead, twiddled my thumbs and waited patiently whilst he tucked noisily into his meal. That was something I'd always noticed. The sound, the slaps and smacks of his lips, tongue, and teeth meeting various food textures. I don't have misophonia, but that man managed to produce noises which utterly perturbed me. I don't care about those who talk whilst they eat. Don't even care about those who eat with their mouths open. No, the racket of this man's feasting disturbed me because it always sounded like more than one person eating. There were even the distant sounds of what I'd convinced myself were tiny voices, as if the man had spent 4 years sneaking friends into the kitchen behind my back, as if they were speaking amongst themselves in hushed tones, muttering odd phrases, not food reviews but comments on culture, comments on countries and histories. This tells us, in the mountains of Malaysia, 400 years ago, the snippets of insights were always too quiet to fully distinguish. Of course, it was the wet sloshing and smacking that stole most of my attention. I tried to make meals that were softer, in the hope that this would lead to quieter munching. I served yogurt, risotto, and so on. No matter what I attempted, the sounds never lessened. And I knew that this was no mean-spirited joke. He wasn't sharing a meal with hidden guests, though I certainly wouldn't have been the first woman to find myself at the receiving end of his bizarre antics. Believe me, over the years I'd considered numerous scenarios in my head, but none of them felt right. None of them warmed my chilled flesh whilst that awful man ate, so I eventually broke. Something came over me. Madness, I suppose, born of years working in a draining environment. All for a healthy heap of bucks. Well, I'd passed my threshold. The money no longer mattered. I had to know. I turned away from the wall. The man at the kitchen table was not eating. Not in any human sense of the word. The sides of his face had opened like the skin of a tangerine, revealing neither hidden tissue nor bone beneath. There was a crater within his skull, a crater into which he was shoveling torn strips of my lovingly cooked flatbread. The meal was not disappearing into a mouth. There was no mouth below the celebrity's unzipped face. Chunks of bread and toppings were washing over a dozen rolling eyeballs, each with a black sclera, a white iris, and a red pupil. Inhuman eyes. Eyes that were not consuming the food, but letting the broken fragments slide off their rolling surfaces, as if absorbing the meal's secrets, learning something from it. And the flatbread did not disappear into the body below. It disintegrated in the black, watery film coating those many eyes. I was too haunted to scream, but I'd already been detected. The celebrity stopped. His hand hovered, and those many eyes, coated in the dissolving crumbs of my meal, swiveled to face me. Then the man started to tremble violently, crushing the remaining handful of flatbread in the pit of his palm. I allowed my mouth to release a meek whimper as flecks of bread clattered against the china plate below. My eyes had already flitted towards the kitchen entrance and the lobby beyond it. The front door was in sight, and my weak legs carried me towards it. But the man did not need to stand to pursue me. He punched his arm forwards, and a long reptilian tentacle tore through his open palm, escaped from its prison of human skin, then shot across the kitchen towards me. I was already crossing the lobby as the lunging limb hissed at me from its black scales. I felt the alien arm's stale breath against my back, cutting through my t-shirt, as that man sought my flesh, not to eat, but to wash over his many eyeballs. He wanted to soak me up, study me, and as I thought of all of the womanizing he'd done over the years, the many flings who'd come and gone, I wondered whether any of them had met that fate. I fumbled with the latch for an eternal second, flung the door open, and triumphantly made it to the porch. But the fine prick of a sharp limb caught my spine as I stumbled onto the driveway, instantly stained my shirt with a staggeringly large pool of blood. Yelping in agony, I pushed onwards, pushed across the driveway, scaled the fence, and ran through the streets of Beverly Hills. I remember little of what followed, barely remember how I ended up in Toronto, in all honesty. I know that I abandoned everything. My home, my friends, my family, and my life. In spite of that, this nightmare isn't over. For months, I have felt something watching me. I'm convinced, just as I'm convinced that this celebrity eats more than people food. I will handle my own breakfasts, the star firmly told me back in 2021. I replied, "Are you sure?" I make a mean, "You would not want to cater to my morning needs," he half growled. At the end of the day, this is about more than getting the truth out there. More than, hopefully, protecting myself from him. This is a cautionary tale. No matter how good the pay, do not become any celebrity's personal chef in LA. I promise you, I'm not crazy. I've seen it with my own two eyes. My living room couch is breathing. The cushions pulsate rhythmically, expanding and contracting as if a pair of unseen lungs lie just beneath the fabric. I sat there staring at it for 3 hours this morning, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a quirk in my vision, anything other than what it seemed. I got up and made myself a fresh, piping hot cup of coffee, but by the time I took my first sip, it had gone stone cold, as if hours had slipped by in mere seconds. My eyeballs felt as if they were on fire. I had to force myself to blink, alleviating the stinging. For what seemed to be the 100th time, I rubbed my eyes. Didn't work. My goddamn couch was still breathing. How could a couch be breathing? It's just a piece of furniture. An auburn lump stained with the remnants of last month's dinner. I knelt down to the level of the couch, my knees hitting the floor with a soft thud. Putting my hand on the surface, I almost expected it to feel warm, alive, almost, but of course not. It's a couch. The leathery surface was cool to the touch, but unmistakably throbbing. My couch is breathing. I wrote an email to the furniture company that day. I know it's been 4 years since I bought it, I said, but I'd like a refund. The couch is breathing. I never did hear back from them. I made up my mind to give them a 1-star rating on their website. I got up from my desk, softly shutting my laptop. Venturing over to my kitchen for a cup of coffee, I stopped dead in my tracks as I passed the living room. My couch looked odd. It almost looked as though it was breathing. I stepped closer. Yep, it was definitely breathing. It made no sense. It was a couch, how could it be breathing? If I strained my ears, I could almost hear it. Two soft, wheezing breaths. It made no sense. Nothing makes much sense to me lately. I need coffee. Where did my coffee go? I was just drinking it. I woke up this morning with a start, 2 hours before my alarm went off. I have these nightmares, you see. Terrible nightmares. Horrifying ones. Ones in which I've committed crimes so heinous, it makes me disgusted to think my brain could come up with stuff like that. I was sweating, and my head was throbbing. Coffee would fix this. I should make myself some coffee. I really love coffee. I stood there in my living room, steaming mug of coffee in my hand, which was strange because I didn't remember making it and I don't like coffee that much anyways. My eyes flickered back to the couch in my living room. It was still brown, still stained, still breathing. I took a sip of the disgusting coffee, only to spit the mouthful back into the cup, because the coffee was now ice cold. I placed the mug on a table and walked over to the couch. Plopping down on the worn-out, brown leather, I let my body sway up and down, gently, with the breathing of the couch. There was a red stain. It seemed bigger than it was the last time I saw it. It was growing, and the couch was breathing. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was the furniture company. "We've received your complaint," it read, the words cold and clinical. Strange. I don't remember making any complaints, but that wasn't the disturbing part. Beneath the message was an image, a photo of me, sitting on the couch, staring blankly ahead with my hand pressed to the cushion. The angle was odd, slightly off, like it was taken from the corner of the room. I hadn't seen anyone. No one had been here. I was sure of it. It was just me and this couch. It was just us. My pulse quickened. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, watching me. But it was just me and the couch. Me and the couch. The couch and I. Just us. Slowly, I looked back at the couch. The red stain had spread, darkening, seeping further into the fabric. I reached out, half dazed, and touched the stain. My fingers came away damp, and I stood up with a start, wiping my hand on my jeans. Felt sticky, almost warm. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but the details kept slipping, as if my mind was fighting to keep things in place. I think I just need some coffee to clear my head. In the kitchen, I hear my phone ring in my pocket. The water boiled on in the kettle, and I picked up the call on the third ring. "Hello, Mr. Me, this is Detective from the police department. We'd like you to come down to the station for a few questions regarding an ongoing investigation. It's important we speak with you as soon as possible." That's funny. Why was the furniture company calling me? Yes, of course, I stammered, trying to clear my throat, my mind still muddled. "Did you say the police department?" "Yes, Mr. Me. The station's address is in the email we sent you. We expect you here in the next hour," the voice said with an odd, almost mechanical precision. There was a pause, and then, in a quieter tone, the detective added, "And please, don't try to clean anything." The line went dead. I poured the boiling water from the kettle into a mug. I took a sip, grimacing as I realized it tasted metallic and thicker than it should. Don't try to clean anything? I walked back into the living room. My head was spinning, and I wanted nothing more than to take a nap on my couch that is definitely not breathing and not blood-stained and not alive and ready for me to nap on. Is my couch breathing? There's a red stain on it I hadn't noticed before. I don't know how I never noticed it, because not only does it take up half the couch, it's also still damp. A fresh wave of nausea rolled over me. I don't remember spilling anything. I don't remember anything that would leave a stain like that. And yet, here it was, spreading like a living thing, taking over the fabric inch by inch. Gingerly, hands shaking, I reach out for the zipper on the cushion cover. Pulling it backwards, I reveal an eyeball. It blinks, and I can hear knocking on my front door, but I can't get myself to go open it because the more I unzip, the more of the face I uncover. It blinks. Morse code. Since when do I understand Morse code? Dash, 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 dot, dash, dash, dot, straight face, dash, dash, dot, dash, dash, dash. I told you not to try to clean anything, the eye says silently. The knocking at the door turned into pounding, and I could hear a muffled voice calling my name. I tried to call out, but my throat closed up, as if something was squeezing it from the inside. The eye slowly turned bloodshot. I was vaguely aware of the red stain growing onto my jeans. "Mr. Me," came a muffled voice from the door. A different voice now, deeper, angrier, as if whoever was outside was about to break the door down. "We need to talk to you about your couch's extended warranty." God, my head hurts. I need some coffee. I wish my wife was still around. She made the best coffee. Too bad she's dead. Too bad she's dead. I open the door. There's a policeman standing there, but I can tell he's really from the furniture police. His clothes don't fool me. "Please," I plead, turning my mug over and letting the coffee spill down at his feet. "My couch is breathing. You have to help me." The furniture couch policeman tilted his head, studying me with a strange, detached look. I caught a glimpse of his badge. It didn't say police department. Instead, it read customer compliance. Beneath it, in smaller print, was the company's name, Furniture Solutions Incorporated. I felt a cold sweat break over me. "Sir," he said, his voice calm and measured, "we've received several reports of unusual maintenance issues. Now, if you'll just let me in, I'll have a look at the couch." I wanted to protest, to tell him that this wasn't a maintenance issue, that I needed real help, not a corporate lackey. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stepped back, allowing him in. He walked over to the couch and ran his fingers over the cushions, tracing the lines where the stain had spread. He leaned in close, inspecting it, and then he pressed his ear to the fabric. My stomach lurched as he nodded, as if he could hear something I couldn't. "It's breathing all right," he murmured. "Classic case. You should have called us sooner." "Classic case," I repeated, my voice cracking. "Oh yes," he said, straightening up. "Say, You don't suppose I could have a cup of coffee while I'm here? Do you? I looked up at him. It hurt to swallow. I don't have any coffee, sorry. Never buy it, don't like the stuff. Looking visibly disappointed, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a scalpel. With a practiced motion, he began to cut along the edge of the cushion. The fabric peeled away, revealing something soft and pink and disturbingly alive beneath. Honey, I couldn't feel the words in my throat, but the voice saying them was unmistakably mine. Oh, darling, I missed you so much. I knelt down to peel the strip of black duct tape off of her lips. I noticed her wrists were raw from the rope that bound them together. I loved her so much. I almost felt as if her wrists were mine. I felt my own wrists being bound together now. That's how strong our bond was. Her eyes were still closed. Taking a nap, I presumed. After all, it was a very comfortable couch. I'm gonna make her a cup of coffee for when she wakes up. Then, I can tell her all about how I was so tired this morning. I almost thought the couch was breathing. It all started when I woke up in the middle of the night and found a strange, suffocating weight on my chest, like someone was sitting on me. I could make out an outline of someone's figure above me, their back outlined by the orange light from the street lamps seeping through the window. I tried to scream for help or turn my head to look at my husband, but I couldn't move. I didn't regain control of my body until after the weight had lifted, and I heard a deep male grunt from a man pulling himself off me. I heard his footsteps too. I saw his silhouette leave through the door, and it was only hours later of laying in that same position that I felt I could move again. It started with a pinpricking sensation through my toes and fingers, then spread through my entire body, like the feeling you get when your leg falls asleep and you have to wake it back up. I immediately went to my husband and shook him awake. He was distraught and confused, asking me to slow down, to tell him what happened. He was so scared by my hysterics he was moved to tears. Even still, he didn't believe me. He said he was right next to me. He'd have woken up if someone came inside our room. He assured me it was all a dream and rubbed my back to soothe me until I could fall back asleep. But a week later, the same paralysis came for me. It was after an argument with my husband over finances. The same terror, the same feeling of someone sitting on my chest, then getting up and leaving the room. This time, I saw something in their hand. A knife? Couldn't know. It was far too dark. My husband again told me it was just a bad dream, that I couldn't afford to keep stressing myself out so much over money. Ever since I lost my job, we've been struggling to make rent. My husband keeps telling me he'll take care of it, he'll take care of us. I think that's some weird masculine bullshit from his time. He's 43, I'm 26. That's the other problem with all this. I'm pregnant, 5 months around this time. The financial strain had been weighing on my psyche and causing me so much stress that I'd resorted to my own means of making money for us. Since I couldn't seem to find another real job, I'd been participating in paid clinical trials in order to make ends meet for us. My husband never asked where the extra money was coming from. He had no idea. He's always been so protective over me. He would have died knowing I was selling my body to Big Pharma. It was a clinical drug trial for preeclampsia, and all they did was give me a small pill, take my blood and my vitals, and send me on my way once a week. Maybe the pills were causing these sleep paralysis episodes. I wasn't sure, but I could never confide in my husband about it. Anyway, a week ago, I went over to my neighbor's house with my husband for a little Halloween party. My neighbors Sarah, 40F, and Tom, 40M, are both so sweet. They left baked goods on our porch every Saturday since I announced my pregnancy. Sarah checked in on me almost daily, texting me asking me how I am, how I'm feeling, if I'm having any morning sickness. Their kindness makes this whole thing all the stranger. At the Halloween party, I asked Sarah for a soda. Everyone else was having beer, but, she told me they have some in her outside fridge, down the stairs in the unfinished basement/garage. So I headed away from the party, fumbled for the string light, and made my way down the creaky wooden steps to the basement. The floor was concrete and cold on my bare feet, so I tiptoed past Tom's latest mechanical mess to the kitchenette and old, rusted white fridge in the far corner. The first thing I noticed here was a red splatter of what looked to be blood on the inside of the wash basin. There were power tools and saws and such down here, as the basement is also Tom's workshop. He could have cut his finger, washed his hands, and not the sink. I shrugged it off and opened the fridge. I was immediately hit with a strange whiff of iron as I swung the door open. There were at least 36 milk cartons coating the shelves inside, with 2 Sprites in the fridge door. I don't know what compelled me then to reach for the milk. Maybe I was really thirsty for it. Some pregnancy craving. Maybe I knew something was wrong. I had some intuition about it. But I grabbed a carton. It was heavy, and the liquid inside didn't slosh the way I expected it to. It sounds strange, like something you wouldn't be able to notice, but I did. I placed it down on the single countertop of the kitchenette, found a glass in the top shelf of the cabinet above, unscrewed the cap of the milk carton, and began to pour. What came out wasn't milk. It was red. It was blood. I vomited in the sink. Tom must have heard me, or knew I was digging where I shouldn't have been. He came down and held back my hair while I emptied my stomach, whispering calm words like easing a brood mare. He called down my husband, who took me back upstairs. He threw my coat over my shoulders and talked quietly with Tom and Sarah by the door. She'll be fine. Just scared is all. No worries. Thank you, yes. I stood there with nothing to say, eyes wide, unsure of what to make of it all. My first ridiculous thought was that Tom and Sarah were vampires. It wasn't until we were walking back across the street to our house that I was able to ask Tom, "What was that?" Tom looked at me strangely, his brow furrowed. "Why were you poking around where you shouldn't be? Are you serious?" They had blood in their milk cartons. Tom sighed, pulled away from me. He was obviously frustrated. They own a farm, live. Okay, you don't know how slaughtering an animal works, do you? He was so angry. I could see his hands bunched into fists, shaking slightly. What are you talking about? They drain the pigs of blood after slaughter. I chewed on this, shaking my head, both of us standing at odds with each other in the middle of the road. So, are you trying to tell me they've filled milk cartons with pig's blood? Yes. Why the hell would they do that? Because it's a thickening agent, high in protein. It's used in a wide variety of dishes. You've probably eaten it before and haven't even known it. I stared at my husband indignantly, feeling shame rising up in me. The last thing I wanted to do was apologize. But here I was, saying sorry in the middle of the street, just to get us back inside the house. My sleep paralysis stopped for a few months after. At my 7th month of pregnancy, it started again. Once a week, usually Sunday nights, I would take my prenatal vitamins before bed and wake up around midnight to find it almost impossible to breathe. At this point, I was no longer sleeping on my back. I was sleeping on my side. Still, the sleep paralysis demon, or man, would straddle my shoulders, his back rising above me like a mountain so I couldn't see anything but the bottom of his feet. Bare, black soles, long toenails that scrapped against the sheets, dirted jeans. Sure enough, it should have been a dream. But one night I woke, crying once again, and after I settled, I found dirt rubbed off on the white pillowcase by my head, a deep red stain on the bed. That same morning in the shower, I checked myself for any hints of damage. When I was paralyzed like that, I couldn't feel a damn thing except the relentless weight on top of me, the inability to fully breathe. The only injuries on me were the bruises on the inside of my elbows on both sides, right where I had weekly blood draws at the clinical trial. The clinical trial my husband still didn't know about, though he should have seen the discoloration on my arms when we had sex, which now was more and more frequent. Leading up to my birth, my husband's behavior toward me became even stranger. He worried incessantly over me, taking me to sleep trials which revealed no abnormalities, arguing with doctors that something was wrong, describing my dizziness, my fatigue, the bruising on my arms. The first time I realized he'd noticed. The doctors said this was all normal for someone during pregnancy, especially nearing the end. I remember at the end of my 7th month of pregnancy, I again had a bout of sleep paralysis. This time, during it, I swear I could hear my husband crying softly. It was hard to make out over the grunts and heavy breathing above me. I asked him over breakfast what he'd been crying about. He was very, very quiet and told me only that he had a bad dream that I was being hurt. Maybe, at the time, I thought my paranoia a problem. Either way, I obeyed it. I no longer trusted my husband, nor did I trust my neighbors, even my own parents. I stopped eating any food anyone made for me and cooked only for myself. I lost weight, became even paler and weaker than before. I stopped attending the clinical trials, and my husband came home with more money, having recently gotten a promotion I didn't believe, as he clocked out of work hours early every day to come check up on me. Except, strangest of all, my sleep paralysis stopped completely. Instead, I slept dreamless, and it was nearly impossible to wake me. I slept for 12, 13 hours at a time without waking up once. One morning, in the shower, weeks after I'd stopped attending the clinical trials and getting regular blood draws, I found strange bruising over my inner elbow, a small pinprick over the vein. In the dark, I hadn't been able to see the lack or presence of bruising, but under the bathroom lights, it was there. I confronted my husband about it. He said I probably injured myself somehow. I should go get checked out, I shouldn't be bruising so easily. I told him that it looked like a needle wound, traced the vein's blueness. He looked at me so strangely. Then his phone rang, and he disappeared into the bedroom. My suspicions had grown intense. Something was wrong. No more sleep paralysis, sure, but someone was visiting me in the night still. I knew it. A few weeks before my due date, I didn't take my prenatal vitamins. It was a Monday. It was midnight, and I was pretending to sleep. I didn't feel the usual unrelenting fatigue I did late in the evening. But still awake, I saw him come in. I closed my eyes quick, heard his heavy breathing over me. Then he pulled the bedsheet over my face, whispered in a rough voice, "All right, girl." I recognized that voice. He reached under the blankets, his hand brushing mine above the mattress. I made a small noise of fear, flinched away. He froze. Then he put a hand on my shoulder, moved the bedsheet away from my face, and even though my eyes were closed, I could feel him studying me, watching me. Once I calmed myself, he continued, taking my wrist in his hand and holding the inside with his 2 fingers. He was wearing gloves, nitrile, and he was taking my pulse, I realized, counting to a minute, the longest minute of my fucking life. Then he placed a hand on my belly, and it took everything in me not to scream. Something cold replaced his fingers, and he held it there. My stomach churned, and my baby reared up inside me. I was going to throw up. No, I couldn't. That's it, he whispered to me, to no one. I realized then how I recognized the voice. Tom. It sounded just like Tom. That was all I could take. I jolted out of my sleep and upright, my eyes meeting his in the dark. Sure enough, Tom was staring back at me. I screamed at him and he raised his gloved hands. There was a stethoscope around his neck like he was cosplaying a fucking doctor. My husband shot up from the other side of the bed. For a moment him and Tom just stared at each other. Then my husband raised his voice in a way I'd never heard before. Get out! Get out! Tom shot out of the room quicker than I could process. My husband chased him out, his shouts and threats echoing through the house. When he came back, I told him we should call the cops. He said no, that wasn't a good idea. He would deal with it. He took a bat from underneath the bed and headed out with it. I tried to stop him, but he left out the front door and didn't return till the next morning. By then, I'd found the milk carton laying on its side by my fallen bedsheets, a plastic funnel on the ground next to it. I felt sick, so fucking sick to think about all that blood in Tom's fridge. My blood. I went to the bathroom and emptied my stomach till I couldn't anymore. When my husband came home, he told me he'd taken care of it. There was blood splattered on his face and the bat. He washed it off in the kitchen sink. I was silent, at a loss for words. Afterward, I watched him put locks on all the doors, draw the shades, and set the alarms. Did you kill him? I asked. My husband just shook his head no. As he locked our bedroom window, he said, just to be safe. Okay? For the rest of the day, we cooped ourselves up inside, watching movies, taking it easy, as he put it. Laying low. I asked him what the hell Tom would want with cartons of blood. My husband looked wildly uncomfortable, said that men are scary. It could have been anything. Could have been selling it on the dark web. That shit makes a lot of money, supposedly. He kissed my forehead and pulled me close. I asked him for the second time then if we should call the police. He didn't reply. Over the next week, he told me I needed to stay home, that he'd go out for groceries, meds, etc. Almost my entire pregnancy, he'd been pushing for a home birth, but now he was adamant about it. Meanwhile, I was having second thoughts. What if something went wrong? What if Tom came by? Whenever I shared these concerns with my husband, he got angry. Eventually, after a heated argument, I asked him if he planned to keep me cooped up like a dog till I gave birth or died. He just glared at me. I said I was going to leave for a little while, give him some time to work through things. As soon as I did, he grabbed me by the arm and begged me to stay. He burst into tears, saying that everything he did for me, that he was sorry for how he'd been treating me, how he'd scared me. But he was scared. God, he was scared. He asked me to stay with him, so I did. When he went to take a shower that night, I again checked our bedroom for anything Tom might have left behind. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Nothing on the floor, of course. It had been a week after all. I would have tripped over anything left over. But under the bed was a spool of rope, cable ties, duct tape. My husband and I had never participated in bondage or anything of the sort. That was my final straw. I had a horrible, horrible feeling. I called my mom and asked her if I could come over. She said, of course. I tried to go out the front door, but it was locked from the outside. I didn't even know that was possible. I tried the back door, locked again. At this point, I was so panicked I started to cry. I checked the kitchen window, locked. Finally, the giant office window was open. 8 months pregnant. I hauled my ass out the window and dropped 5 feet into the garden. And I ran, caught an Uber, and made my way to my mom's place. I've been here 2 days now. I have endless missed calls from my husband. I don't know what the hell to say to him. I'm not sure if I think he's just paranoid, or if he's somehow a part of this whole thing with Tom. What the fuck should I do? Should I go back home? I don't want to give birth without my husband, but he's scaring me. Tom is a whole other problem I'm too afraid to fully confront. I'm thinking of going back home tomorrow and explaining myself to my husband, getting answers to the questions that have been plaguing me, and leaving if I need to. I don't want to do anything too drastic, like call off the marriage before I know the whole story. But I guess I'm afraid to know what the hell the real story is. What do you think? Should I try and fix things before I give birth? Should I call the police? My friend Alex and I went camping at Red River Gorge last year. He never came back. The police say I made up what happened, a twisted way of coping with losing him. They think it was an accident, or maybe that I'm hiding some horrible truth. But I know what I saw out there. I know there's something in those woods. A creature, a monster. It's out there, hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. I can still hear the crunch of leaves and the way the night seemed to breathe around us. It started as a perfect autumn hike, the forest glowing red and gold in the setting sun. But when darkness fell, we weren't alone. We thought it was just nerves or our imaginations running wild in the quiet, but that was before the thing in the woods started stalking us. It was just past midnight when I heard it for the first time. A faint rustling, almost like footsteps, circling the edge of our campsite. I opened my eyes and looked over at Alex, who was lying stiff in his sleeping bag, staring wide-eyed at the trees. His breathing was shallow, barely a whisper above the crackling embers of our fire. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, voice trembling. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. We sat up slowly, peering into the darkness, trying to convince ourselves it was just a deer or a raccoon. But the sounds were too careful, too deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. Then, just as quickly as it started, the rustling stopped. Silence filled the air again, thick and oppressive. We waited, our ears straining, but there was nothing. Alex exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as he mumbled something about going back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there was still watching, lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. By morning, the fear had faded, almost like a bad dream that didn't quite stick. The golden sunlight trickled through the trees, painting the forest in a warm glow that made everything seem safe again. Alex and I exchanged uneasy smiles as we packed up our gear, shrugging off the strange sounds from the night before. Maybe we just psyched ourselves out. It was easy to let the dark play tricks on your mind. We decided to take the Oxier Ridge Trail that morning. Known for its sweeping views and jagged cliff faces, the trail felt like the perfect way to ground ourselves, to let the beauty of the gorge erase the eerie feeling that lingered. We hiked along the narrow path, laughing off our shared paranoia, enjoying the crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp autumn air. As we reached a clearing, we stopped to take in the view. The gorge stretched out below, a stunning cascade of fiery reds and deep greens. For a moment, it felt like we'd escaped whatever darkness had brushed against us last night. But as we continued up the trail, a nagging feeling crept back in. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps echoing through the trees. As we rounded a bend, the trail dipped back into a dense stretch of woods, and the comforting sunlight faded under the thick canopy. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and a chill pricked my skin. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine, but then I heard it, a faint stirring in the leaves not too far off. I stopped, grabbing Alex's arm. "You hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely steady. Alex paused, listening, then shrugged, giving me a reassuring smile. "Probably just a deer, or maybe a fox," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "This place is full of wildlife. Don't worry." I nodded, but something about the sound felt wrong. As we moved on, I kept glancing over my shoulder, catching the barest hint of movement in the distance. The rustling started again, closer now, and it seemed to follow us, stopping whenever we did and picking up again when we walked. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through. It was following us, and every step sent a fresh wave of dread down my spine. After another hour of hiking, we came upon a shallow, natural cave, a perfect spot to set up camp for the night. The rock face overhead offered some shelter, and the area felt secluded. Alex set off to gather firewood while I unpacked our gear, arranging our things to make the space as comfortable as possible. As I finished unrolling the sleeping bags, I heard leaves rustling somewhere in the distance. Assuming it was Alex on his way back, I went back to my work, but the footsteps sounded strange. Light, almost fleeting, like something or someone was darting through the trees. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps broke off, disappearing into the silence. Moments later, Alex emerged from the opposite direction, carrying another bundle of wood. He was whistling, completely unfazed. My heart lurched. Whatever had been moving out there, it hadn't been him. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, noticing my expression as he dropped the wood by the fire pit. "Alex, I heard footsteps," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just now. I thought it was you, but it was coming from the other direction. And they ran off right before you got here." He raised an eyebrow, glancing over his shoulder into the darkening woods, then back at me with a reassuring smile. "Sarah, it's probably just an animal. This place is full of them. You're spooking yourself." I shook my head, my hands fidgeting as I tried to explain. "No, it was different, Alex. It sounded like someone was following us. First on the trail, now here." My voice cracked, and I could feel my pulse pounding. Alex stepped closer, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice calm. "It's just us out here. Okay? I'll keep the fire going tonight. Whatever you're hearing, I promise you, it's nothing that can't be explained." But even as he said it, I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. And as the firelight danced across the mouth of the cave, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. After we finished our meager dinner, Alex tended to the fire, piling a few larger logs onto the embers to keep it burning through the night. The warmth and steady crackling sound, along with the clear, star-studded sky above us, calmed my nerves. Slowly, I drifted off, the tension of the day slipping away as sleep took over. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I felt a hand shaking my shoulder. My eyes flew open, and there was Alex, wide-eyed, whispering urgently. "I heard something," he said, barely above a murmur. It sounded like sticks breaking, just over there in the trees. He pointed to the edge of the campsite, his voice tense but steady. A chill swept over me, and immediately, my mind flashed back to the rustling footsteps I'd heard earlier. Every nerve in my body was on high alert as I sat up, scanning the dark edges of the trees. Alex had his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, darting back and forth as he listened, peering into the shadows. For a moment, it was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then, just beyond the circle of light, I thought I caught the faintest rustling, barely there, like something moving through the underbrush but trying to stay hidden. My heart raced, my breath coming quick and shallow. Alex and I exchanged a glance, and in his eyes, I could see he was no longer dismissing it as just an animal. Something was out there. "Stay here. Keep the light steady," Alex whispered, gripping one of the smoldering logs from the fire. He flicked his flashlight off, nodding toward the edge of the woods. "I'm gonna get close, see if I can catch it off guard." My heart pounded as I held my flashlight steady on the spot he'd pointed out, illuminating the edge of the trees. Alex slipped down the hill quietly, moving just at the edge of my light's reach. I could barely make out his figure as he neared the trees, and then, in one quick movement, he stepped into the shadows. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling, and whatever had been lurking there bolted deeper into the woods. Alex turned his flashlight back on, its beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted after it. My light caught a flicker of movement just for a second, but it was enough. I saw a figure, barely visible, dressed in dark, earth-toned clothing, vanishing into the trees. "Alex, stop! Come back!" I screamed, my voice cracking, but he didn't even turn. He kept chasing, his light flashing sporadically through the dense trees, growing fainter with each step. I strained to listen, my breath held tight, but after a few moments, his footsteps faded into nothing, leaving me alone with only the sound of my own heartbeat echoing through the silence. The wait felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. The forest was silent, the fire crackling softly beside me. Then, finally, I saw it. Alex's flashlight, a steady beam cutting through the darkness, aimed directly at me. Relief washed over me at first, but it quickly faded when I realized he wasn't saying anything. He just kept walking, the light fixed on me, growing closer. "Alex!" I called, squinting, trying to make out his face beyond the blinding beam. But he didn't respond. The light stayed on me, unwavering, unblinking, illuminating every inch of me while he stayed hidden in the shadows. A strange unease settled over me, tightening in my chest. My heart pounded as I forced myself to ask, "Alex, are you okay?" Nothing. Only the beam, sharp and unyielding, keeping me pinned in its glare. I shifted uncomfortably, nerves buzzing. Something felt horribly wrong, and my stomach twisted with a dread I couldn't explain. I squinted, trying to see past the light, but all I could see was that beam, focused solely on me. "Alex, this isn't funny," I shouted, my voice wavering. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, a sense of dread clawing at my insides. The silence was suffocating, and the flashlight beam remained fixed on me, unyielding, as if studying me. Then, just as my fear began to tip into panic, the light flicked off. I blinked, my vision swimming in the sudden darkness as my eyes struggled to adjust. Shadows danced across the edge of the firelight, and the trees seemed to close in around me. My breath hitched, my chest tight with fear as my vision finally cleared. And then I saw it, the figure standing there, just barely visible in the fire's dim glow, wasn't Alex. The shape was wrong, too tall, too still. It loomed, silent and unblinking, watching me with an unnatural intensity. My blood went cold as I realized it wasn't my friend who had come back. My hands shook, and I stumbled back, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from that dark figure, rooted in place by a terror so profound, it left me paralyzed. I sat frozen, my mind racing but my body locked in place as the figure lingered just beyond the firelight. A silent, hulking shadow. Every part of me screamed to run, but the darkness surrounding us felt too vast, too full of unknown horrors. And the thought of what it might have done to Alex held me there, gripped in a kind of terror that swallowed me whole. The creature then lowered itself, crouching down, its face finally catching the glow of the fire. My stomach twisted as I took in its features. It wasn't a man. The face staring back at me was stretched and elongated, more animal than human, with a dog-like snout covered in thick, dark brown fur. And those eyes, two sickly, yellow orbs reflecting the firelight with an unnatural glimmer. Realization hit me like a cold slap. The brown I'd seen earlier wasn't clothing. It was fur. This thing had never been human. Horrified, I turned over, yanking my blanket up to my chin, curling in on myself as if it could somehow protect me. I lay there trembling, waiting for the inevitable, the lunge, the sharp pain of claws or teeth. But nothing happened. The creature just stayed there, crouched, watching me in silence. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity as I shook under my blanket, my breath shallow, my mind on the edge of breaking. But still, it didn't move. It just stayed there, keeping its vigil over me, as if it had all the time in the world. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to erase the creature's face from my mind. But those eyes, the sickly yellow glow, piercing and unblinking, were seared into my memory. It sat there for hours, crouched just at the edge of the firelight, watching me in a silence that felt like it was consuming me whole. Every second stretched and twisted, each heartbeat feeling like it could be my last. The terror was so intense, I thought it might kill me right there in the darkness. I lay there, shaking, clutching the blanket as if it could protect me, my mind spiraling in endless fear. But the creature never moved. It just stayed there, its eyes drilling into me, studying me with a patience that was somehow worse than anything it could have done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it shift. My heart hammered as I listened to it stand, its massive form looming in the dim glow of the fire. For one awful moment, I thought it was coming toward me, but then, slowly, it turned, and I heard its heavy footsteps fading away, each one feeling like a small mercy. Only when the forest returned to silence did I dare open my eyes, my heart still racing as I stared into the empty woods, too afraid to move, too numb to comprehend that I'd survived the night. I stayed curled up, clutching the blanket, listening to every small sound, every crackle of the dying fire. It felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to turn around, to face the space where the creature had crouched, watching me. I slowly lifted my head and looked over my shoulder. It was gone. The sun was starting to rise, casting soft light through the trees, a light that felt like salvation. I let out a shaky breath, feeling my whole body begin to release the terror that had gripped me. That thing, whatever it was, had kept me frozen in terror for over 4 hours. The longest, most horrifying hours of my life. The moment the forest was bright enough, I scrambled to my feet. I didn't even bother with the campsite, leaving everything behind as I bolted down the trail. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging, and tears streamed down my face as I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. Branches scraped my arms, and roots snagged my feet, but nothing slowed me down. The fear pushed me forward, every step taking me farther from the nightmare I'd somehow survived. As I tore down the trail, my vision blurred by tears, I suddenly stumbled upon a pair of hikers making their way up from the direction I'd come. The sight of other people, real human people, nearly broke me. I collapsed before them, trembling, my body giving in to the weight of the fear and exhaustion. The hikers rushed over, their faces etched with alarm as they knelt beside me. They asked what had happened, if I was hurt, but I couldn't speak. The terror choked my words, the images of the night still too raw, too vivid. I sat there, gasping, trying to steady my breathing, until finally, the lump in my throat loosened enough to speak. Something attacked my friend Alex, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The hikers exchanged a look, a mixture of concern and disbelief, but they didn't question me. One of them offered me a bottle of water, and after a few moments, they guided me back down the trail. Every step felt like agony, my body heavy with the shock and fear of what I'd endured. It took 2 hours to reach the parking lot, 2 hours where I glanced back over my shoulder more times than I could count, fearing that I'd see those sickly yellow eyes watching me again. When we finally reached the lot, I climbed into my car, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Without a second thought, I drove straight to the nearest police station, the fear still fresh in my mind as I prepared to file my report. After filing my report, the officers exchanged wary glances before one of them asked me to accompany them back to the campsite. They didn't say it outright, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe a word I'd said. To them, I was just some distraught girl, maybe imagining things after a traumatic night. But despite their disbelief, they agreed to look into it. An officer escorted me back through the trail, my heart pounding with each step. When we reached the campsite, I showed them where Alex had gone into the woods and the spot where I'd last seen him. The officer looked around, taking notes, his face carefully blank. He finally nodded, saying they'd open an investigation into Alex's disappearance. But I could tell by his tone that he didn't expect to find anything. As he escorted me back to the parking lot, my eyes darted constantly to the surrounding trees, every rustling leaf and shadowed branch sending a fresh wave of dread through me. I half expected to see that creature lurking, watching, waiting to strike. But the woods remained still, eerily quiet as we walked. When we finally reached the lot, I climbed into my car, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. The officer gave me a final nod and a reminder to call if I remembered anything else. But I barely heard him. The moment I could, I turned the key, pulling out of the lot and driving home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. All I could think of was Alex, lost somewhere out there in those woods, and the thing that had taken him. The call came the next day. I could barely bring myself to pick up, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach as the officer's voice came through the line, calm and practiced. They'd found Alex's body at the base of a cliff. He said it was a long fall, and that Alex's body had been badly mangled on impact. I felt numb. I remember the first time
words
I saw
barely
it.
registering
I had
as
been
I
walking
listened.
my dog down
My
my
mind
street,
raced back to
minding
the
my
creature
own
I'd
business,
seen.
when something
yellow
caught my
eyes
eye
glowing
on the
in
other
the
side of my
firelight.
next-door neighbor,
The way it had stalked
Mr.
us
Carlson's
through the trees.
lawn. I
After
tried to tell
standing
them
there
again,
for a moment,
to make them
unable to put
understand
my
that
finger
what had
on it,
happened to Alex
I
wasn't
eventually
just a
noticed
fall.
the key
I told them
just
about
hanging
the
there
monster,
in the doorknob of his
about
front
how
door.
it had chased him
Not
into
thinking
the
too
woods.
much of it,
but they dismissed
I went on
it
with
just
my
as
walk
quickly
and
as
immediately
before.
forgot about
The
it.
officer's
But
tone
then the
was
next day I
sympathetic
saw
but
it again.
firm.
People
People
die
die
out
the
there
next day
every
after
year,
that,
he said.
and the next
cliffs
day
are
after
steep,
that, Eventually, after a week had passed, it's easy to lose your footing. I started to get worried. He wouldn't believe me. See, the thing is, none of them maybe written off the key as a simple mistake. Alex's death was just another tragic accident. Mr. Carlson was quite old and frail, case closed, and had stopped leaving his house a long time ago. Something had hunted caretakers for groceries, something that drove Alex over that cliff, which brought me to my next conclusion. A hollow feeling it must have been one of his caretakers. I was left with the terrible certainty that the monster in those woods was still out there, and surely would have noticed the key, waiting for whoever was unfortunate after 2 weeks of indecision path next. I worked up the courage to walk over to Alex's parents' door. Was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Placed my hand on the doorknob. His mother's face still hanging with grief as the words left my mouth. As I turned it and she collapsed, I couldn't help but hear a faint echo, unable to bear the sound of a couple people shouting from 100 yards away. I stopped and looked dark and accusing. Nothing. As if he somehow thought I was to blame, and opened it. I couldn't find the words to defend myself. I braced myself. Not that they would have helped. Closing my eyes. I'd been there. Upon opening Alex them, hadn't come home. I simply saw an empty foyer and let out a sigh of relief. I haven't been able to set foot on a trail. Was the thought of being out in the woods again sends a shiver down my spine. Was nowhere near what I'd soon discover. And even the sight of a forest from a distance makes my skin crawl. Before shutting the door behind me, either not peacefully. Suddenly, when I closed my eyes, the lights went out back at the campsite, and I saw, under that cruelly bright Mr. Carlson and Brenda, with the creature crouched, our neighborhood post office worker, staring on the staircase together, yellow eyes, a look of horror in their eyes. I lie awake, Mr. Carlson, wondering what a relief, and why it didn't finish me off. I haven't seen her in a week. I question gnaws at me, remembering I know I'll never have an answer. Lack of mail all I know is that it's out there, talking about, waiting in the dark. Looking back on it, and no one will ever believe together. But what possibly could the disappearance of our mail person and a key in my neighbor's door have in common? I was about to find out. Brenda, what are you doing in Mr. Carlson's house? She simply replied, "They key." "Oh, it's yours?" I asked, letting out a sigh of relief after spending 2 weeks running through every possible reason for it being left in the door. But before I could bask in the moment, she interrupted me. "No, it's not mine, or his," she said, before turning to Mr. Carlson, who looked exhausted. "It belongs to him," the old man said. "Him?" I asked, confused by where he was going with it. "The man who visits us," Brenda said. "Visits you? What do you mean?" "Just wait. He'll be back, especially now that you're here," Mr. Carlson said. "He's right. I entered just like you did, after dropping off the mail and wondering if something was the matter, finding Mr. Carlson here and that I was trapped inside. And within a few minutes, the man arrived," Brenda explained. "Wait, what are you trying to tell me?" "That you're trapped here," the old man said. "Trapped?" I laughed. "Yeah, okay. Is this some sort of Halloween prank? What with the lights off and everything?" That's when I casually walked back over to the door and tried to open it. Click, but it didn't budge. I stood there for a moment with my back to Brenda and Mr. Carlson, wondering if maybe there was some truth to what they were saying. And that's when I heard him. "See, a horse," disturbing voice called out from behind me. "They're right. You're trapped." Chills ran down my spine as I realized that the voice couldn't be coming from Brenda or Mr. Carlson. I couldn't bear to turn around, so I simply called back to the voice. "Who are you?" "I'm the keeper of the keys to your worst nightmares." I turned around to find a man standing there in the darkness, his eyes glowing and keychains dangling from every inch of his body. "Let us out," I screamed at him, pretending to be courageous, but terrified by the mere sight of such a thing. He simply replied, "Certainly," before looking at his body and removing a particular keychain with one key on it. "Yes, this one's for you," he said as he handed it to me. "This will open the front door from the inside. Go ahead, leave." I looked at the key, then back at the door, then back at the monster and smiled. "You idiot. Why would you ever give it to me? I'll be back with the police. And you better not be here." Then I walked over to the front door and inserted the key. "Don't do it," Brenda cried out. "He's tricking you," Mr. Carlson added. But I was too compelled by my plan to listen to them and proceeded to turn the doorknob. Click, it opened. "See," I said, as I turned back to Brenda and Mr. Carlson with a smug look on my face. They simply shook their heads in disappointment. I turned back, opened the door, stepped outside, and shut it behind me to find myself in a bedroom, my childhood bedroom to be exact. What the? I thought to myself as once again, chills ran down my spine. Feeling unsettled by being in there, I opened the door and entered the second-story hallway, where I heard the sound of someone being strangled in a nearby bedroom. Normally, I would have been shocked to hear such a sound, but this was one that I had heard before. This was a memory that I was reliving in real life now as an adult. A tear rolled down my cheek, as I knew exactly what was happening in the other room, and despite my attempts to hold back, I couldn't stop myself from rushing into the bedroom and trying to stop him. But just as it had unfolded in real life many years ago, by the time I opened the door, it was too late. My father was dead, strangled to death by my brothers for reasons I'd only later find out. "Andrew, no," I cried out, but he had already crawled back into the corner of the room, simply staring at my father's lifeless body. That's when he looked up at me and charged at me like a ravenous zombie, managing to claw away at one of my arms before slam. I shut the door and ran downstairs, expecting to find my mother down there, just as I had found her when the event had originally happened. But all that I found was Brenda and Mr. Carlson, staring up at me with wide eyes. "I'm sorry," Brenda said, seeing the expression on my face. "How did you know?" "Because it happened to us, over and over, no matter which key he handed us." "No, it can't be," I cried out as I began to shut down, unable to believe what they had told me. But I should have. As I stood there, shaking in horror, I heard the sound of keys rattling, and I turned around to find the monster standing there again. "What do you want?" I cried out, but he didn't answer. He simply looked down at his body and removed a particular keychain with one key on it. "Yes, this one's for you," he said as he handed it to me. I looked at the key, then back at the door, then back at the monster, this time unable to smile. I knew another horror lay before me, knew that the key would not help me escape the house, but for reasons I can't quite explain. Maybe I thought there was an inkling of a chance that the key would work, or maybe it was a desire to see my father again. I took it anyway, took it and opened the door, only to relive the same horrifying memory and return back to the staircase where Brenda and Mr. Carlson were standing. Once again, the monster returned. Once again, he handed me a key, and once again, I disappeared through the door. This went on until I couldn't bear to take it anymore, and eventually gave up on the keys being of any help. When I finally declined the man's key, he simply replied, "Have it your way," before disappearing into the darkness. I turned to Brenda and Mr. Carlson, who went on to explain how they, too, had tried the keys and experienced nightmare after nightmare from their respective past. Then we all retired to the living room where we slept on the couch, chair, and floor, respectively, reasoning that we should stay in the same room. The next day, we huddled together, eventually coming to the conclusion that the house, its door, and the keys must be some sort of twisted test, caused by the key in the home's front door, and enforced by the monster that wore an armor of keyrings. We tried everything, from scouring the home for exits, to attempting to make calls on its dead phones, to prying at its boarded windows from the inside out. But after a week had gone by without a single lead, we eventually gave up. That's when someone else arrived. "No!" we all screamed, our voices surely echoing outside just as I heard them, as Officer Howe turned the key to the front door and let himself in. By the time the door had closed behind him, it was too late, and 3 had become 4. Once again, the monster returned, this time offering Officer Howe a key, who took it and let himself out, experiencing a nightmare of his own, only to return from upstairs a short time later with a look of horror in his eyes. After we told him our stories, he too declined the monster's next key, and we once again huddled together, eventually deciding that the answer must not lie in the house itself, but with the monster. But how do I stop it? I wondered. The next time he arrived, we tried to forcibly attack him as a group, but he simply waved his hand and froze us all in place until he disappeared back into the darkness. That's when I got an idea and took off after him into the darkness, following him for what felt like hours through a dark void until he reached a bedroom of his own. "What is this place?" I asked. "My own nightmare," he replied as he turned to a younger version of himself, asleep in bed. Suddenly, I saw a window slowly pry open as a masked man broke in and moved towards the young man with a knife. Not knowing what else to do, I sprang to the young man's rescue, darting toward the intruder and grappling with him, waking the young man, who watched on in horror as the masked man was somehow impaled on his own knife and toppled out the window. After catching my breath, I turned back to the young man, who had a smile on his face. "Thank you," he said as he handed me a key. I stood there in silence, unable to believe what had happened, before turning back to the monster, who I assumed had been watching the whole time, but he was gone. I turned back to the young man, who was still staring at me, then stumbled backwards out of his room and back into the darkness, where I turned around and walked back in the direction I had come from. When I finally emerged from the darkness, holding the key, I found Brenda, Mr. Carlson, and Officer Howe all standing there in the foyer, a look of shock on all their faces, having clearly expected that I would never return. I didn't say anything. I simply walked over to the home's front door, inserted the key, and opened it. Suddenly, a ray of sunshine burst into the home. I took a step outside and stood there for a moment, until my eyes eventually adjusted to the daylight, and I found myself outside Mr. Carlson's home. The door still open, I looked back inside the home and saw Brenda, Mr. Carlson, and Officer Howe standing there in disbelief. I signaled for them to join me. Brenda and Officer Howe followed, with big smiles on their faces, overjoyed to escape the horrors in the home. But Mr. Carlson, he simply stayed behind. "Mr. Carlson, what are you waiting for?" But he didn't reply. He simply took a seat on the staircase. "Do me a favor? When you shut the door, leave the key inside the doorknob," the old man said. "But why?" I asked, unable to understand why he would choose to stay inside the place. "So I can see my son again," he explained. I then closed the front door of the house and looked down at its now keyless doorknob before reaching into my pocket for the key that the young man had given me. Officer Howe ran over to stop me, but it was too late. I had already placed the key in the doorknob and locked the door. He gave me a look of horror as I turned to see my wife pulling into my driveway next door. I looked over at her, and after spending what felt like weeks inside Mr. Carlson's home, expected her to be shocked to see me. But my wife simply waved hello, as if I had never left. "Don't forget to walk the dog," she called out casually, before turning off the car and walking away into our home next door. As Brenda and Officer Howe looked over at me, still shocked by what they had just experienced, I knew the minute I walked into the party that I'd made a mistake. The bass throbbed like a heartbeat, rattling the warped windows of the old mansion and vibrating through the soles of my boots. Jenna Swanson's voice cut through the crowd like a razor blade, drawing all attention to the center of the room. She had that laugh, you know, the one, high-pitched, musical, like she knew she was always on stage and everyone else was just part of the background. Her eyes, a wicked green under her glittery cat-eye makeup, zeroed in on me as soon as I crossed the threshold. She took one look at my costume, a hastily thrown-together sexy vampire ensemble with a black corset, fishnets, and fake fangs, and sneered, her smile like a knife. "Sexy vampire?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Bold choice, her friends laughed, an echo of mockery that prickled under my skin and twisted in my gut. My face flushed so hot that I felt like I might actually catch fire, but I forced myself to smile. I tried to laugh it off, make a joke, anything to deflect, but my voice cracked, and Jenna's laugh pierced through me again, sharp as broken glass. That sound echoed in my head, digging in like a song you can't get out of your mind. My palms were already sweaty, and my grip on the flimsy plastic solo cup was slippery. So yeah, not the greatest start to the night, but the house itself didn't help my growing unease. It loomed above us, a hulking, crumbling monster of wood and stone, one of those old estates that people loved to whisper stories about. It had been abandoned for decades, swallowed by vines and shadows, standing at the edge of town like a guardian of forgotten nightmares. Rumor had it that the original owners had vanished mysteriously, leaving behind a legacy of ghost stories that no one could quite agree on. The mansion's front doors were enormous, sagging on their rusty hinges, and flanked by statues of twisted, grinning gargoyles that looked as if they might come to life and pounce at any moment. Inside, the place was even worse. Creaking floorboards, cracked crown molding, and a stale, musty scent that clung to everything. The faded wallpaper was peeled back in places, revealing a web of black mold creeping across the plaster like veins. It was the perfect place for a Halloween party, as long as you didn't care about the very real risk of the entire house collapsing around you. I stepped deeper into the chaos, weaving my way through clusters of classmates in elaborate costumes. They danced, laughed, and shouted over the pounding music, the fog from a machine curling around their legs like ghostly tendrils. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cologne, spilled alcohol, and something else, a metallic, almost coppery scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The shadows seemed to cling to the edges of the room, thick and alive, like they were watching us. I'm not great with crowds, okay? Or with parties, for that matter. I'm not one of those people who thrive on being the center of attention or get energized by loud, chaotic gatherings. I'd canceled a diner shift to be here, determined to make an effort for once, to be normal, to feel like I belonged. But the whole thing felt like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and I couldn't shake the creeping anxiety gnawing at me. I forced myself to stand by the makeshift bar, clutching my solo cup like a shield. The liquid inside smelled so strongly of alcohol that it burned my eyes just holding it. I took a tentative sip, and the bitter, chemical taste made my throat tighten. It felt like poison, and I swallowed with difficulty, trying to ignore the unpleasant burns spreading through my chest. People around me were getting increasingly wild. One guy in a werewolf mask howled at the ceiling before grabbing a girl dressed as a fallen angel, pulling her into a drunken dance that looked more like a wrestling match. Another group was chanting, their voices merging with the relentless bass in a way that made me feel disoriented. I rubbed my temple, wishing I could retreat into myself, wishing I could blend into the shadows and disappear. That's when I felt it. A slow, ominous heat building behind my nose. My body's early warning system. I get stress nosebleeds, and they always come at the worst possible times. It's like my body's way of announcing to the world, hey, I can't handle this. Middle school had been an unending horror show because of it, and I'd gotten good at recognizing the signs. The prickling sensation, the way the back of my sinuses seemed to catch fire. I knew I had maybe a minute or two before it would start, and I desperately needed somewhere to hide. I slipped away from the main room, trying to move casually even though my heart was pounding. I pushed past a group of juniors who were dancing so close that it looked like they were trying to merge into a single entity, and ducked into the hallway. It was quieter there, but only a little. Music and laughter leaked from closed doors, and somewhere deeper in the house, I thought I heard a door slam hard enough to rattle the windows. I walked quickly, my boots tapping against the floorboards that groaned under my weight. The air felt colder here, almost damp, like I'd stepped into a different world. I tried the first door I came to, but it was locked. The second door opened a crack before slamming shut on its own, as if pushed by an invisible hand. My pulse quickened, and I took a shaky breath, telling myself it was just a draft, just the wind. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway. The last door was covered in deep scratches, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way through. My hand hesitated on the knob, but another hot wave burned at the bridge of my nose, and I knew I didn't have a choice. I twisted the knob and slipped inside. The room smelled like mildew and something even more unpleasant, something that made me gag. A sharp, acrid stench, like old cat piss or rotting wood. A broken mirror hung on the wall, reflecting shards of distorted light, and the carpet squished under my feet, damp and spongy. The walls were lined with sagging bookshelves, their contents swollen and warped by years of neglect. I sank down onto the floor, my back pressed against the wall, and pinched the bridge of my nose. I closed my eyes, willing the bleeding to stop, my head spinning from the combined sense of mold and decay. This wasn't just a bad party. It was starting to feel like a waking nightmare, like something out of the ghost stories people told about this place. I tried to distract myself by thinking about my parents. How furious they'd be if they knew where I was. How they'd lecture me about responsibility and safety. But the thought was hollow. This was supposed to be my night, my one chance to be something other than the responsible kid, to feel like I belonged somewhere. But it felt more and more like a mistake, like a choice that had set something terrible in motion. I don't know how long I sat there, but gradually, the noise from the party faded, blending into a muffled background hum, until something new sliced through the quiet. A heavy, deliberate thud. Footsteps, echoing up the staircase at the far end of the hall. They were slow, purposeful, each one making the floorboards creak and groan. My heart stuttered, and I held my breath, frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, each one a drumbeat that sent shivers down my spine. Whoever was coming wasn't in a hurry. They moved like they had all the time in the world, each step heavy enough to make the walls seem to vibrate. There was a pause, a silence so profound that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and then a splintering crash shattered the stillness. It sounded like a door being kicked in, the wood cracking like bones. Screams erupted from somewhere nearby. A boy's voice, high and breaking with panic, followed by a girl's raw, terrified shriek. The kind of scream that made your body want to run even if your brain couldn't process the danger. My muscles locked, my back pressed so hard against the wall that it hurt, and I squeezed my eyes shut. The crashing, splintering sounds got closer, mingling with more screams. The door to the room I was in rattled, and my breath caught in my throat. Footsteps moved past, floorboards groaning under the weight, and I didn't dare to move, barely even dared to breathe. Then, without warning, the window exploded inward. Glass shattered, raining down in glittering shards, and I screamed, throwing my arms over my head. When I dared to lower them, my mouth went dry. A huge figure lay sprawled on the floor, half covered in glass, as if they'd been thrown or had jumped through the window. Blood streamed from his neck and forehead, and his eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. He looked like he'd been in a car crash, or worse, and a choked noise escaped my throat. "Holy shit," I whispered, my voice shaking. My hands were trembling, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave him. That babysitting first aid course hadn't prepared me for this, but I had to try something. Anything. My nose had started bleeding again, and I swiped at it with my sleeve, trying to think. I leaned forward, my knees digging into the carpet, and reached out to see if he was breathing. He made a horrible, wet gurgling sound, and panic flared in my chest. I was about to shout for help, or at least try to, when a voice cut through the room, cold and smooth as silk. "Naughty," it said. I jerked around, my heart slamming into my ribs. In the doorway stood a woman, and everything about her screamed danger. Her hair was dark as midnight, falling in waves that framed a pale, perfect face. Her eyes were outlined in black, and her lips curled into a smirk that revealed sharp, glinting teeth. She looked like she belonged in a Tim Burton film, all shadows and elegance, but there was nothing comforting about her. Her eyes glinted with a predatory amusement as she stepped forward, boots tapping softly against the broken glass. She tilted her head, looking at me like I was something interesting to dissect. "No respect for seniority," she said, almost playfully. "You interrupted our game. How rude." I didn't know what to do, what to say. My mouth was dry, and the taste of blood lingered, coppery and metallic. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her gaze pinned me in place like a butterfly on a board. She knelt beside the man on the floor, and her eyes gleamed as she leaned in, her lips parting. Before I could even react, she sank her teeth into his neck, and the sound, the wet, sickening sound, made my stomach churn. The man convulsed once, a horrible, choked noise escaping him, and then he went still, limp, lifeless. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot as she straightened, blood smeared across her perfect mouth. She wiped her lips delicately and turned her gaze back to me, her smile widening. "We'll need more blood soon," she said, almost like a joke, and then she gestured for me to follow. My legs moved of their own accord, my brain screaming at me to fight, to resist, but my body didn't obey. It was like being trapped in someone else's nightmare. The living room was transformed. My classmates, The same people I'd known since elementary school stood in glassy-eyed trances. The vampires, because that's what they were, moved among them, whispering in their ears, guiding them away one by one. The trance would break just before the end, and the screams that followed made my blood run cold. It was a feast, and we were the main course. I was shoved onto a couch, and someone pressed an 4-bag into my hands. It was filled with blood, warm and thick, the metallic scent making me gag. The woman from before, Morticia, I started calling her in my head, watched me with dark amusement. "Drink up," she said, her voice silky. "Since you've started early." I clutched the bag, trying not to vomit, trying to blend in, to look as hypnotized as the others. My hands shook so hard that the blood sloshed inside the bag, but I forced myself to keep still, to plaster on the best fake smile I could manage. The vampires moved around the room, laughing, drinking, like this was just another party. But their eyes were always watching, always searching for any sign of resistance. When they weren't looking, I slipped away, my legs moving stiffly, my stomach twisting with fear. The kitchen was empty, and I tried the back door, but it opened into gray nothingness, a shifting void that made me feel dizzy and nauseous. Desperate, I stumbled toward the sunroom, but when I stepped through the glass doors, I found myself back in the same hallway, facing the opposite direction. It was like the house itself was alive, warping and twisting to trap us. I tried to call for help, but my phone showed nothing but static. No signal, no emergency line. The isolation was suffocating. I had one job now: keep the vampires tipsy on the blood packs, hope they stayed distracted, and pray that someone, anyone, would come to our rescue. But the blood packs were running low, and with each empty one, the vampires' eyes grew hungrier. I'm typing this out now, hoping someone will find this message, hoping someone will know that I tried. I'm not a hero, just a scared kid in a sexy vampire costume, trying to survive a nightmare that feels far too real. And if you're reading this, please send help. I am, finally, brave enough to post this. I do not care about the consequences. I may be arrested and prosecuted for treason. I shall not use my real name. You can call me Rares, Sergeant Rares Buzescu of the Romanian Army. This is what happened to me in October 2022. I was in a military unit in the delta of the Danube, in the north of the Dobrogea region of Romania, under the border with Ukraine. A little bit of context for those unfamiliar with the places. That region of Ukraine is southern Bessarabia, sandwiched between Romania and the Republic of Moldova, and it used to be Romanian territory. It has had a turbulent past, belonging during the centuries to many states, being strategically important. In those days, a lot of confusion and fear were present in Romania. Being close to war, rumors of incidents made things very tense. People were afraid. Several Romanian military aircraft were brought down. The Ukrainian forces admitted they did it accidentally. Romania, being a NATO country, any incident like this could degenerate into a war with either Russia or Ukraine, and Romania to be in the front line of destruction of World War III. That night, we heard explosions before the alarm was set. It seems some missiles coming from the north of the border hit Romanian targets. It was a chilly, autumn evening. It would not be the last incident of this sort. We did not know if they were the Ukrainians or the Russians. The colonel summoned us to prepare for marching to the target. The delta of the river Danube is split between Romania and Ukraine. It is one of the last true wild ecosystems in Europe, an official biosphere reservation. It is basically a huge marshland where the Danube splits in smaller channels until it flows into the Black Sea. We followed orders, of course, in silence, in the thicket. The explosions stopped. Some fires in the distance were visible. We could not make out if they were across the border or not. Suddenly, gunshots were heard not very far. We were ordered to be prepared for combat. Another military unit was pretty close. They were dispatched first. When we finally reached the location of the first flames, we could see that there was an explosion earlier in the evening on Romanian soil. On the other side of the border, things were burning as well. Our comrades from the other unit have reached the location. Some were already fallen, dead, or wounded. In fact, most of them were down. It was here war, for real for the first time, felt unreal. I was a soldier, I knew this was my purpose, but it was not supposed to be like this. It felt unreal also, it did not expect it. I mean, in Romanian history, as we were taught in school, Romanians fought bravely against our enemies, against the Ottomans, the Hungarians, the Soviets, and the Nazi. But then at least it was clear whom and why we were fighting. Now we did not. Finally, we found a living soldier. He was breathing heavily when the colonel shouted at him, "Report! What has happened?" The private answered, "They attacked us. They fought each other on the other side. Then they came to us. The Russians? We don't know. We were bombarded and they came shooting. They looked insane and fired at us like they had rabies." Honestly, at this point, he was breathing hard. The colonel left him, looked around in the silence, and ordered us to cross the bridge into Ukrainian territory. We obeyed. We were soldiers. Soldiers obey orders. But we knew what this meant. A part of me wanted to just flee. No, I was not afraid of death or physical injury. I was afraid of being part of this and suffering and dying senselessly and shamefully. I would have preferred to have been dead by some previous disease or something to have killed me before getting into this. I even hoped a loose bullet would take down now before being engaged in the fight. I was not old, I was in my late 20s, but I wanted to die with a clean conscience then to get on with this. I thought of running and being put to trial like a deserter. Perhaps I would have been executed. The thoughts rose up, one after the other, in my mind. We crossed the bridge and the colonel brought us, as the last remains of daylight disappeared, in thicket. I didn't even know if the colonel knew what he wanted. It doesn't matter anyway. Trees formed like a small forest. On the other side of the border, almost complete darkness and chill. A shadow creeped upon my heart. It was something else, something different from what I felt before. A fear not just of death, a fear not just of dishonor. It was something else that engulfed all my previous fears, worked alongside them and made them stronger. Then it started. They ran and fired. I could not make out if they shouted in Russian or Ukrainian or both. I do not understand either. And the uniforms were not clear. They fired at us, each other, in every direction. Colonel ordered to engage in fire. We complied. I fired at any non-Romanian soldier I could see holding the gun towards us. Some seemed to have been Ukrainian, some Russian. I did not care. It did not matter. Some of them were hit, some of us were hit. I became numb. I desperately knew I had not just to protect myself, but my comrades. At least this was something I could do, something to hold on to and not just pointing the gun at me and finishing me off. It seems I already killed several people the first time in my life. Were they allies? Were they foes? I did not know. Something was tearing inside my soul, a part of me. Yes, I have made a great mistake joining the military. I was not made for this, at least not in this situation. I think I could have been a war hero, but in World War II, not in World War III. This was my thought as the Russians and/or Ukrainians mingled with us. I felt no physical pain, as they hit me chaotically and I responded as non-chaotical as I could. A warm liquid touched my hand gently. I realized it came from my shoulder. I was hit by a bullet and did not even realize it. The enemies looked, like the comrade said earlier, like being on rabies. Their eyes wide in terror, mouths opened. They charged at us, but were also running from us. As we entered the woods, the clash became even more chaotic, as darkness engulfed us and little to no light was visible. My heart was beating hard, as we lost it and started running with no sense deeper inside the woods, like being driven. Incidents became fewer. The clash went cold and silence took over almost completely. I continued to run deeper in the darkness. I heard callings in Romanian. I asked one of them, then decided not to in order not to attract attention to myself. It was cold, bitter darkness. Suddenly, I hit something in the dark, something that blacked my way like some kind of net that held me fiercely. No, I was not tangled, more like glued to it. I tried to force my way out of it, but the more I forced it, the less I was able to release myself. My mind felt almost completely helpless of handling this new thing, and it started to shut down. Yet, like a faint whisper, a thought came to my mind. Take the knife, combat knife, from your boot, while you still can, and cut it out. Fast. I obeyed the thought and managed to get the knife. Fortunately, my right arm was almost completely free of the thing, and I was able to grab it and started cutting. It was hard to achieve this at first, but I think it was good that it was hard. If it came to easy, my mind would not have calmed down, would have not settled down, and I would have restarted running blindly. I was desperate at first, seeing that it was so hard to cut, especially since I clearly felt I needed to get out as fast as I could. As I struggled with the process, I started to become aware of my situation and surroundings, and even if I knew I had every reason to finish it as soon as possible, I was able to evaluate my situation and what was around me more calmly. Few people were around at this point, few gunshots, some screams from time to time. The darkness felt unreal and intoxicating. I tried to get rid of this thought, as was starting to get hold of myself, but I could not escape it. And something like whispered in my thoughts, something very bad will happen to me soon, if I do not get out soon from there. Indeed, as I was getting close to cutting it completely, I heard a rumble in the trees behind this net, from up, towards me. For the last 2 seconds, before breaking free, I even caught a glimpse of something moving, but I escaped and went backwards. This time, I was determined not to lose myself so easily, and, although I was far from being safe, I walked slowly and, eventually, decided to stop and evaluate. The almost complete darkness felt unnatural, like some sort of black mist that, once entering the lungs, made my mind like being into some sort of drug. I thought this could be chemical weapons or something. I stood on the spot and opened a flashlight from my haversack. I was able to bring the light only for a few meters in front of me, like the light got lost into that mist. I was able to see the trees around, no person in sight. I went towards what seemed to me like the way out, slowly, looking around. Some small sounds were heard in the trees. Suddenly, in front of me, in the upper branches of the tree, I saw something white, standing there. It was shaped like a human, but engulfed like some sort of a whitish or grayish shroud, with legs tied together, like an Egyptian mummy. It twitched a little, and then I realized that the same matter the shroud was made from is the same as the leftovers of the net on my hands and uniform. The shape in the tree moved, and I realized pretty fast it was not moving on its own. Something moved the shape from behind, and I could see a dark thing, almost the size of the human shape, covering it, and some dark, articulated arms taking over the white shape. I could not bring myself to move and stop watching. The dark creature stabbed the white shape in the chest area and started some sort of sucking from it voraciously. Dark fluid came out to the ground, and a striking, disgusting smell of blood mixed with something I did not know what it was. It was a spider eating its still living prey. I turned my flashlight around me, around the trees, and noticed that this tree was not the only one with victims wrapped in cocoons. My blood ran cold when I realized that above me, in the canopy, the spiders were moving. How many of them there were, I do not know. I started to run towards what seemed to me like the exit of the woods. No living person was in sight, although I could see corpses all over the place. From time to time, some cocoon swung in the wind or had fallen to the ground. I stumbled into one, almost falling. I could feel that almost nothing but bones were left, engulfed into some goo that stuck to my boot like a glue, sticking the tip of my foot with the cocoon, and I had used the second boot to let go while I could hear clearly something above me coming down pretty close. I managed not to lose myself and escape just before an unbearable stench almost touched me. Less than a minute later, in front of me on the trail, a thick web with something really big moving on the other side. An insidious sensation of deep danger came over me as I watched the thing from behind. I went backwards, looking behind and around me, for a way out on another track where I could see no web or creature. But this was a really bad idea as I stumbled more into the woods, especially since I was unfamiliar with the place. I stopped in my tracks for a while, trying to figure out what to do. I listened around me, faint noises around me, scratches not very far, but not too close either. No living soldiers, only dead or dying. From time to time, where was everybody? Has someone escaped? There was no way of knowing. I was trained to face difficult situations, but this was beyond all I ever imagined, as this new enemy was unlike any I prepared to face. I needed to meet someone, anybody. I sat down, listened, and sniffed. Yeah, I sniffed. Strange odors, marsh combined with weird, unpleasant smells. The darkness itself felt unnatural in itself, like it was absorbing light, so to say. The flashlight could not reach far. It was like it faded into some fluid. Was I afraid of death? Yes, I was, but that was not all. I would have preferred a death that I could understand, a death I could expect, if it makes sense, but not this. I did not understand what was going on, and that made me feel that all my experiences, all my training was not just useless, but also senseless. I kneeled on one leg and looked at the ground, not knowing what to do. I listened, trying to calm myself even further so that my rational mind shall find a way. Then I heard a rustle in the tree next to me. I had the first impulse to just run, but something in mind told me it was a bad idea. I do not know why. I turned back slowly, towards the source of the sound, making sure not to point the light directly at it. I was clearly a spider. It was almost 2 meters long, and it dropped something towards me. I snapped and jumped towards the place I came from, but another of those creatures was in there. Then, I heard gunshots from sideways, sounded like an AKM. Bullet flew above my head, like someone aimed at the creature behind me. It gave a shriek, and it seemed to stop. I dared not to move, waiting for a ceasefire. And it did. I heard footsteps coming fast towards me. I noticed my benefactor. It was a tall, muscular woman with long, black hair. I noticed the Ukrainian flag on her uniform. She came fast towards me, grabbed my arm and pushed me towards some bushes I had not looked before. I let her guide me. It felt like she knew the place. I could not ask anything. We were silent. She gasped for air as she pushed me. I hope it is clear there. We shall see, she said. What to be clear? I asked. A small underground shed or refuge, she replied. I think I can find it. My flashlight was a clear advantage, being able to see it even if at a short distance, the webs, and we were able to avoid them. Those things were in the trees, mostly not on soil, fortunately, even if at some point a pretty large one charged at us. I think we missed it. We need to go back, she added and turned us around. I could hear a rustle behind us, but not too close. It felt like we moved in circles for about 5 minutes. I felt much longer, but I am sure it could not have been more. Until she knocked with her boot something almost completely covered in fallen autumn leaves. We stopped. Here it is, she said, as she started to remove the leaves, showing a hatch, then going down to open it. As I went down too to help her, I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, where the bullet hit me, but I did not care too much. She succeeded in opening the hatch, but something blocked the full opening. A few bullets burst from inside, as the rustle from behind came closer, and I knew that, if there is to get in, we should do it fast. She shouted something in Russian or Ukrainian. A male voice responded from below. They argued a bit until I said, if he lets us in, do it in the next seconds. It is very close, as a spider about the size of a 10-year-old child was only a few meters away. She started to plead, and it worked. The man managed to push the improvised barricade at the hatch to let us in. The woman went first. As the creature came closer, I struggled to turn around in order to keep my eyes on the spider, as it was inches from me. I placed, without realizing it, the flashlight towards the creature. 2 things happened at the same time. First one, I saw a being that was deeply dark, so dark that it made shiver, emanating something like it wanted to consume me as fast as possible. Something I could feel in its eyes that I could not distinguish, but that I could feel strongly they were there in that giant black mass. The second one was that the creature stopped in its tracks when the beam of light hit where I felt the eyes were for a few seconds. Those seconds were enough for me to get through the hatch. I tried to close it, but the pain in the shoulder made me unable to pull, and a dark shape covered the little light coming from outside. Coldness took over my body, and the stench made me nauseated. I could hear sounds of a mouth chewing nothing, in anticipation of chewing my flesh. A harsh, sticky, hairy, black articulated arm entered just for a few seconds, before a bullet from inside hit the arm. A shriek with splatter, and the arm retreated, just enough as a thin man, wearing a Russian uniform came, pulled the hatch, then locked it. Fortunately, I did not drop the flashlight, and a second flashlight, held by the man, made enough light to see underneath that it was a small underground structure, more like a refuge. I am not sure if this was to be a refuge or some storage place, since many provisions seemed to be deposited, mostly crates covered in dark green canvases. The man went towards the end of the corridor. There were a few rooms on the left and right, but he went to a larger one at the end. Some chairs, a blanket, some food on the floor, guns. The two spoke in Russian and/or Ukrainian. Sorry to interrupt, folks. Could we speak English, please? I do not know either Russian or Ukrainian, I said. They stopped and looked at me. He answered, okay. Then, it makes sense. I looked at him. He appeared around the age of 40, pretty thin and short, but stocky in a way. His almost complete shaved head was covered with a small military cap. What is going on? I said. They stood silent for a few seconds. Then the man started, not breathing too easily, like trying to remain calm. We fought for about 2 days before they came. We did not plan shooting into Romanian territory, but as casualties arose in such a short time, weirdness started. As lack of sleep builded up, some of us start to act weird, not all in the same way. At first, they were only dreams and hallucinations. I do not think they were hallucinations now, of being attacked in their beds by some small creatures. Some showed small scars on their bodies, but they were dismissed since we were in the middle of a battle. Some started to turn on each other. The colonel ordered detention. Then all who behaved aggressively were shot. The Ukrainians kept fighting. We had to fight back. Soon, we did not know how much we fought the enemy and how much we fought each other. I did not know who I could trust, if I could follow orders or not. Then those things started to appear. I did not pay much attention to them, trying to keep myself from being killed by my comrades. But I could not deny it when I first saw a black spider near the edge of the camp, eating away from the still living body of our cook. I managed to get close to Yuri, one of my comrades who felt still sane, and we retreated in the center of the camp, until the order came to leave a large part of the equipment and get into the woods near the border, and we were dragged alongside the rest. In the fields, those creatures attacked us, some trying to fight back. But even from those who we still able to understand this is a new, non-human enemy we had to deal against, seemed too confused and unable to fight back properly. I heard we were about to clash with the Ukrainian foe, that the Romanians seemed to have crossed the border, as a response of the provocation, when me and Yuri managed to run away and get into the woods on our own. But the spiders were there, more of them and larger. Yuri was caught by a very large one, just before I stumbled across the hatch. I found my way in and barricaded the entrance. The woman started. Pretty similar things happened to us as well. Small spiders were seen at first, biting people who started acting weird. Unfortunately, our colonel was affected pretty early on and started just shooting people. The major shot the colonel and shouted he is the new commander. Some protested, and someone I could not identify shot the major. The floodgates were open and my comrades started turning on each other. I hid myself up to a point. Then, like in his case, I was taken with the flow. As the people started to head towards the woods, I gave a sigh and looked at them. My country may be enemies with any of your countries. I understand not to talk about certain aspects. But right now, what matters is that those things are a common enemy, and in the end, all of us are human. We need to work together to escape. They looked at me, the woman smiled and nodded. The man gave a sigh and nodded as well. I think it is okay to introduce ourselves. I am Sergeant Rares Buzescu, Romanian Army. The woman said, Lieutenant Alina Kirkova, Ukrainian Army. The man said, Private Dmitry Fedorov, Russian Army. We shook hands and started talking on a strategy. Alina tried to help me with my shoulder. Some stinky goo was on my uniform. Fortunately, it was barely more than a scratch, and she managed to keep it covered from the goo. We ate a bit, took some vodka, then went to the entrance to listen. I found out that Dmitry was from Ekaterinburg, that he lost his father when he was in primary school. He told us he used to be religious as a child. Then he became colder into faith, but not atheist. He told us he prayed for the first time in a while tonight, and he feels that only God can help us. Alina told us that she was from Kyiv, that she joined the army years ago, that she was always a competitive girl as a child and teen who loved female action heroes, that she was a convinced feminist. Then, after a while, being disappointed in real-life military life, left it and became a hairstylist. She held a YouTube channel where she posted ASMR videos with haircuts, hairstyling, and massages, while being dressed sexy. The channel gained some following. She did some interventions like pumping her lips. She planned breast augmentation. When war came, she was called to arms, on the basis of her previous formation. I told them that I was from Susiava in the north, that I was not particularly religious, that I became a soldier due to the war games and RPGs I played as a teen, and that I justified it to myself somewhat thinking of the patriotic literature I was taught in primary school. I told them I was never truly religious, that I went to the Easter service, to weddings and funerals, and that was about it. Dmitri told me it makes a good idea to start praying now, and he showed us the cross his late grandmother gave him that he never stopped wearing. The surroundings were mostly silent, but we did not dare to come out, as we still felt their presence, like waiting for us to get out. I started, "Those flashlights shall not be out of battery soon. The night is still pretty long, so we need to decide quickly what to do. I hear them screeching on the outside. Is there any way for them to break in?" Alina replied, "There are some ventilation shafts sideways as far as I know, but they are pretty narrow. I don't know. If there are little ones, as they seem to change size, they may enter. I say to secure them," I answered. They agreed, and we started searching each chamber for the vents. They were pretty narrow, they were not hard to cover with cloth, although the metal covers were kind of rusty. We have had enough supplies for a few days, and decided to put the flashlights off and stick them together near the entrance, and watch the clock from time to time. We allowed ourselves to sleep for about 90 minutes at a time, but never all at once. As we sat, we felt like some force, let's say, I cannot find a better term. In the air, something that took away, slowly, my will to fight and live, and I started not just feel, but also live like it was just a question of time before I shall become the meal of the creatures, like they spread something in the very air we breathed and it entered our tissues. Neither of them seemed to know if this was a weapon of either armies. They seemed sincere enough. Dmitri started praying. He said he felt like it, the paraclesis of the Mother of God, then the Acatist of Saint Demetrios of Thessaloniki, who was his patron saint. We felt a clear release from the shadow on our souls, although not totally. I dared to have a little sleep, then Alina fell asleep alongside me. Suddenly, Dmitri woke us up. "There is something in the first room on the right," he said. "We secured them. What can it be?" I asked. "I do not know. Let's have a look," he answered. We managed to get up and open our flashlights and get into there. There was something screeching in there, behind a wooden box. Carefully, Dmitri removed it to discover a dead mouse and, behind it, a hole between the floor and the wall, probably made by mice. Alina gave a sigh of relief, probably thinking it was a mouse. Dmitri looked carefully around, pointing with the flashlight around. I felt dread. I knew that was not a mouse that made those sounds, even if it used, probably, the mouse hole to enter. With my flashlight, I managed to get a glimpse of something larger than a rat, something black that ran away from my light, before jumping upon Dmitri's left leg and piercing the flesh through the pants. I hurried to help him, and I saw a black spider, larger than a tarantula, firmly embedded in his leg. Pointing the light upon it, it gave some sort of screech. It was clearly uncomfortable with the light, but it held on. I grabbed my knife and tried to stab it between the head and the abdomen. It was not easy, as I had to be careful not to get bitten myself. Dmitri fell to the ground, and I used his lack of balance to crush the neck of the spider with the knife, and a black, sticky fluid came out of it. Dmitri grabbed it with a piece of canvas and pulled it out fast, with a grimace of pain, breaking its head from the rest. "No, you should not have done that," said Alina, going down next to him. "The mouthpieces will remain in the flesh." Dmitri was panting as the fluid started to stick to his clothes and the clothes to the skin. "Fast, we need to remove the head and the pants." I was a bit confused, since I did not know what to do. "We need to improvise." "I shall try with a knife." What followed was a kind of brutish improvisation. I am not sure how much Alina knew what she was doing. She tried to pull out the mouthpieces from the wound with the knife. I think she kind of fumbled. I actually tried to call in Romania, since the border was close and I might have got some signal, but it did not work. Alina tried to wash the wound with some vodka. Dmitri endured pretty stoically, only with some moans. "We need to get him to a hospital as fast as we can. This could be lethal soon," said Alina. "Either death or losing my mind, like those before me," replied Dmitri. "No, I do not think there is any way to reach any hospital soon. I think this is it." "Stop it," said Alina. "With this attitude, you shall die surely. Without it, at least you have a chance." Dmitri started laughing bitterly. "No, I know it, I feel. This is how it is supposed to happen. I prayed earlier. I am quite at peace now. You can either let me die, or if I get insane like the others, you can either shoot me or send me out to eat me. Alina looked at him with a mix of anger and frustrated desperation. But Dmitri continued. One of us needs to die in order for the rest to escape. They shall enter this place before dawn, one way or the other. They are really hungry and we know it. I prayed when you thought I was sleeping. I remember how Saint Demetrios, my patron saint, the Christian military imprisoned for Christ, prayed in prison that Nestorius, the Christian fighter, would defeat the giant champion of the pagans, Laos, like David defeated Goliath. I remembered how, when the pagans discovered that the prayer of Saint Demetrios helped defeat Laos, they killed him and he became a martyr. Tonight is his night, the night between summer and winter. The choice is yours, mine if already taken. No, shouted Alina. Cut the crap. We shall all escape. We shall take you to the hospital. We shall escape this. She started to make plans out loud on how to leave. My heart felt something in the words of Dmitri, like some power was in him, like a little bit of the peace he had come to me as well. Earlier, when I fought outside, I never prayed a bit, but now I started to feel like doing it just by looking at him. Nonetheless, I helped Alina, both in discussing tactics and in putting them in practice. We improvised some torches from pieces of wooden box with cloth and vodka to keep them away. We also improvised some Molotov cocktails from vodka bottles and cloth. Alina was very pushy about this, and I really admired her for that, as I admired Dmitri for his attitude. In a way, both of them were completing each other. You know, said Dmitri, coughing, I have heard about things like that years ago. It is not the first time this has happened. They came where people fight and kill each other. It makes them stronger. They are greedy in suffering and death. They are terribly powerful, but they are not by far undefeatable. I never heard anyone escaping something like what we go through now, but I trust the Lord that you have a chance. And, in case you didn't escape, be ready to die. Ask for the Lord to forgive you for all your transgressions. Say your sins to each other. It is not like confessing them to a priest, but it matters. I shall start myself, whatever I tell you now. Tell a priest you trust. This is my final confession. And he started telling us his sins as we prepared. We could not stop him. What he told us then I shall not disclose, but I told to a priest after I escaped. Alina refused to confess in front of us, and that made me reluctant to do it either. Dmitri gave a sigh as all was ready. Forgive each other. Love each other. Please forgive me for everything. Pray as much as you can. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Be prepared for both life and death. Death will seem certain, but it is not. By this time, he was already coughing bad. His face became bluish-gray. He could not walk on his own. I took him and helped walk on the stairs. Alina held both a torch and a gun. I held only a torch. She opened the hatch. A cold breeze that felt like it would have frozen my bones, if it weren't something else holding me. Both me and Alina. The webs were all over the trees. The air was thick and difficult to breathe, like it intoxicating us with terror and hopelessness. One side of me realized all this, and the other side was tranquil. The result was like watching all this detached. Somehow, we used the compass to determine where south was, and the plan was to go south, as much as possible, to exit the woods. We stepped out. No rain, only an autumn breeze. We felt them around, we felt the trees above us, but they did not move. I helped him walk a bit, then he signaled me I better let him walk on his own. I was reluctant to, but I complied. After a few meters, I realized he backed out a few steps. I turned to him, Alina turned as well. A spider the size of a large dog came out from the canopy and stabbed him in the back, but he was still standing. Alina opened her mouth in terror. I could not move. Dmitri spoke. I don't know how he was able to speak, since he was stabbed in the back. Christ is victorious already. You need to accept to be victorious in him. Go now. The Mother of God is with you. The Lord himself is with you. Go now. And always remember, Christ is victorious. And with that, he fell to the ground and the spider started devouring him. Something like an iron claw passed through my soul. Alina broke out crying. I don't know how, but something pushed me. I took the gun from her and grabbed her arm and started running towards the first clear path we could see. The air was really thick, hard to breathe. Not like a city smog, but like something else. It was a clear night, not very cold, but I felt like I was in a frozen giant basement cage, surrounded by a crowd of predators that allow me to live for a few more seconds, not for my sake, but because they compete with each other to have me. The webs were all over the place. We could not just feel them almost all around, not just hear them, but also see them in the trees. We needed to run. If we stayed in one place, their mere presence would build up some sort of poisonous fear that would take over soon, the building up being unavoidable even if they do not grab us. I lost track of sense and direction. I went into any clear passage between the trees. The torches kept them at bay for a little, only for a few moments. I knew that, if we stopped, they would gain courage and strength to take us, but it was enough. Alina cried muffledly. I felt her strength going down. Do not let go, sister, now. You remember how you saved me earlier? Now is my turn, I said. God is with us. We should rely on him now. There is no other way. The last phrase came out of my mouth half without realizing it. For a second of disbelief, I looked out into the front of us. On the path, there was a big spider almost 2 meters long. I saw no immediate escape. Alina felt feeble, like she just wanted to kneel and give up. I shouted, Lord, protect us. Mother of God, cover us. Saint Demetrius, help us. I was quiet for a second, then said gently, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us, the sinners. I fired the gun into the creature. I gave a horrible shriek, backed up. Alina stood up like something gave her a boost of energy, of life. We saw another clearing and we ran towards there. We stumbled upon webs several times, only barely touching them. At one point, Alina got stuck with her shoulder in one web. It was nothing serious, but a spider the size of a dog came pretty fast. I managed to set the web on fire before breaking Alina free. The fire started to spread pretty fast. They feared fire, as even light from a flashlight was probably unpleasant for them. Less than 3 meters away, the darkness ate away the light. It was surely not a natural darkness. I could not stare at it too much, as it made me feel like I was sinking into something unreal. In a way, it was like quicksand for the mind. I almost stumbled several times. On the forest floor, we often stumbled upon human bones or piles of goo that had some leftovers like pieces of clothing, showing that they were part of a human body. We circled around several times because we found ourselves again in front of the flames. They were more widespread. It was clear they hated all the fire. Their shrieks turned into some type of screams that could easily break someone who was faint of heart. It was like they went into my very bones. The fire was our only hope. Alina was breathing heavily. It was clear that she could not resist too much. I stopped for a few seconds and looked into her eyes. She tried to be tough, but she was clearly pretty close to giving up. I said, look, they are afraid of fire. I do not know if it is to exit from this, but at least we can take down as many as we can. We have several Molotov cocktails. I shall hang the gun on my shoulder and ask your help in getting them out of my haversack and light them up to throw them into more places in the woods to get as many of them down as possible. Do you think you can do it? Alina looked faint at me. I crossed myself, then I crossed her. Indeed, as Dimitri said, the Jesus prayer helps. At my signal, light them up and throw them. Please at least try. Alina smiled and tried to settle herself in the new arrangement, and we left just as a pretty big spider got close to us. We moved into an area that was far from the fire. I asked Alina to light up one of the bottles. It was really hard to do it while we walked, but she managed to. We soon had the chance, since there was a big one, in a tree wanting to jump at us. I took the bottle and sent it into the spider. The tree got on fire fast and we ran. Alina seemed into some new energy state, but it felt like it was something from outside. We repeated it several times. The fire took over different parts of the forest. The fear in my mind not just got stronger, but it started to blow like a wind. It felt huge anger from the creatures that turned into hatred. We prayed the Jesus prayer almost ceaselessly, just to keep us standing. Mentally, it was like running a marathon on a very narrow path with the mountain slope on one point and a deep precipice on the other. We finished the bottles and I started firing the gun over and over, as those things came more and more towards us and faster. At some point, we remained out of bullets. We were held by something or someone. No way we could have survived and not break. We could have lost it or died 100 times. At some point, Alina stumbled and fell to the ground. Her torch fell to the ground as she laid down, breathing heavily. I tried to wake her up. She was clearly at the end of her strength. She went to sleep on the leaves. At that moment, two things happened, one through the other. A dark shadow, greater than the darkness I was already accustomed with, covered us, and with thuds, giant articulated legs surrounded us, covering almost the entire clearing. It was good that Alina fell to sleep then, and she did not face the giant beast above us. I did not dare to look at it, as drops of unholy toxic saliva fell upon us. I heard the chattering of a giant mouth ready to chew us at once in such haste that it would not take its time to cover us into a cocoon and suck us. Even the invisible dark eyes felt like wanting to devour us, to suck us in a second, before the mouth reached us. I do not know how the stench did not make me pass out at once. And the second thing was that, for a moment, I looked at one side of the clearing and I could see the field and the clear night sky. Mother of God, help us. Lord, have mercy on us. Perhaps my heart would have just stopped before the mouth ever touched me. When I heard a voice, perhaps in my mind, I do not know, the voice of Dmitri, who said, "Get up and place the torch into its mouth. Then take the small knife from your boot and push it inside the enemy now." Perhaps my heart stopped beating. I do not know. I was already almost gone. But a terrible, yet amazing force took me up and made me push the torch inside my mouth. That force felt like a shield that protected us from death or from having our minds blown by the scream, so that I was able to get the knife out of the boot and stab the being close to the mouth. The torch fell to the ground, the creature stood up in pain, and that invisible force made me, or helped me, take Alina in my arms, rise and start running, inside the tornado I was in. I do not know how I found myself out in the fields, running with Alina in my arms, sleeping. Unearthly screams were heard behind us, from the woods, and I heard the creature coming towards us at an immense speed. I was like skydiving at a huge speed. I heard one last huge scream and a blast. I stopped and looked back. The being exploded out in the fields as the forest was on fire. I grabbed Alina and continued running. As we moved away from danger, my strength diminished. I let her down in the grass and tried to wake her up. She opened her eyes and gave a sigh. "It is over," I said. "The Lord saved us. He worked through Dmitri. Praise be the Lord." She started crying. I gave her a hug.